thanks everyone for coming out tonight. We're here to talk about and present the draft phase 2 scope of work for the Buckley Mann property.
Can you speak up a little?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. We're here to talk about the draft phase 2 scope of work for the Buckley and Mann property on Lawerence Street. I will talk a little bit more about what phase 2 means as we get on in the presentation. Just as a matter of update, our last meeting, of course, on August 7th was to present the public involvement plan itself. We are in receipt of your comments. We are preparing a response summary. We will provide that response summary within the next couple of weeks. That will be posted on the DEP website. It will be inserted into the document repositories, the 2 libraries, and a note will go out to the mailing list, letting everybody know that that's available for public review of the response summary. Shortly after the response summary goes out, we will then finalize that public involvement plan, and we'll look forward to the next step, which will be the 20-day public comment period for this particular document, the phase 2 scope of work that we're going to talk about tonight. So, let me see here. Here's our outline for tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about the site history. This is the 3rd time I've presented in front of the public about this site, so it'll be a little bit more brief. You can catch up on some of the details on the online versions of the previous presentations, but I will go through some site history because I think it's important to build up and talk about the site history and and how it leads to our plan for investigation in the upcoming months here. I want to talk a little bit about the MCP process. That's the Massachusetts Contingency Plan. That's the Massachusetts state regulation that governs the assessment and remediation of hazardous waste sites in our Commonwealth. And there's some lingo that's used in this presentation, and then you'll see over the course of this project as you're following our deliverables. I'll talk a little bit about some of that lingo just as a means of making that a little bit more clear to the layman. Then we'll talk about the planned environmental sampling. That's the actual phase 2 investigation, the scope of work that we intend to perform in the field to move the project forward. And then a little discussion about what the next steps are. Wrong way. So here's the picture that we've all seen. Oops. A couple times before, and just a brief history of the site. We have an industrial facility, a textile manufacturing facility that operated from the late 1800s until 1994. In general, there were 2 operations that were at work here over the course of its history. We have a dye house in this building and a carbonizer in this building. The waste streams, there was a liquid and solid waste stream from each of those operations. The liquid waste stream from the dye house was conveyed through a trench to 2 lagoons to the west. And the liquid waste stream from the carbonizer building was conveyed to the north through the carbonizer trench into the carbonizer lagoon. Solid wastes were consolidated in area number 10. Those were dye pastes, those were fasteners for textiles, those were demolition debris, that was used equipment that were consolidated into area number 10, and area number 10 later becomes the sensible place to bring all of the other wastes when the remediation is completed. I've got other features on here, but let me just leave it at that and we'll get to some of the other stuff. Here's the site history. So as I said, they operated the mill here until 1994, and so in 86 to 96, that's when the initial phase 2 site assessment work was done. And this was in preparation for closing up shop, I would imagine, and then moving on to another location and cleaning up finishing operations there and then cleaning up the property. So from 86 to 96, the initial phase 2 site assessment work was completed. 96, 97, they prepared a release abatement measure plan, RAM plan we call it. And the RAM plan was essentially their remediation plan. And so the RAM and site remediation occurred in 98 and 99. And that plan included cleaning up some satellite areas where waste had been dredged from lagoons, consolidating solid wastes that had been placed around the site, and sifting through the solid waste that was in that area number 10 to identify some grossly contaminated materials, take that stuff off site, and then consolidate in the historical landfill area on the site, regrade that over that area number 10, regrade the waste material, and then place a 3-foot layer of clean fill over the top of that, and that served as the consolidation cell for waste. And so you brought all the waste, the solid wastes that had accumulated on the site, and put them in one spot, covered it with clean fill to protect living things, humans, ecological receptors from coming into contact with contamination. And then a big part of that remedy was an activity and use limitation. So if you were going to leave contamination on site, you need to put measures in place to ensure that in the future, people don't go back and dig holes and expose contaminated soil, bring that soil to the surface where it's accessible for receptors, human and environmental receptors, to come in contact with contamination. So the activity and use limitation said, hey, look, if you're going to dig anywhere within this line, and that line included the consolidation area number 10, and it also included 2 lagoons, the 2 wastewater lagoons, then you need to take the precautions of hiring an LSP, developing a soil management plan, and taking care to make sure that you don't spread contamination around the site. In 2017, the Mass DEP conducted an audit of the AUL. This is a routine audit that they do on quite frankly, every site where there's an activity and use limitation. And they identified some administrative deficiencies with the AUL. One of those is they neglected to put a residential restriction on the property. That one's more easily remedied than what I call the technical finding, which was the prior work had neglected to properly characterize environmental risks. So that's risks from exposure to contamination by ecological receptors. So that could be plants, that could be animals. And so in March and April of 2018, we went out and collected some additional samples from the Carbonizer Lagoon. It was identified as an area where there hadn't been as much investigation as there should have been, perhaps. And when we sat down and reduced that data, we decided that it was going to take longer than the May 15th deadline to complete that environmental risk characterization. And so we retracted the permanent solution, we terminated the AUL, and now we've moved back to phase 2 of the cleanup process. And that's what we're here to talk about today, the phase 2 scope of work, which is our plan for phase 2 investigations. Threw a lot of stuff at you right there. Let me talk a little bit about the Massachusetts Contingency Plan and some of the definitions. The MCP, as we call it, it's a release-based program. So sites come to the attention of Mass DEP when a release is identified by a property owner or an LSP, and there are certain circumstances where the LSP is obligated to report a release to Mass DEP. And here's a definition of a release. It's about what you would expect. It's chemicals being released into the environment. And there's a whole list of reportable thresholds or scenarios where an LSP, if they discover certain things on a site, need to report to Mass DEP. But the simplest one, and the one that applies to this site, is if you find a chemical in soil or groundwater that exceeds a reportable concentration, then there's a notification requirement. The LSP, the owner of the property, the LSP, are obligated to report that to Mass DEP. Mass DEP assigns a release tracking number, RTN, and that's the file number that they use to track the owner's progress towards achieving a permanent solution. And that's the goal of every release, is the notification gets you into the MCP, and a permanent solution gets you out of the MCP. So the RTN is the way for Mass DEP to track the file as it moves towards phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and ultimately to a permanent solution. So let me talk a little bit about reportable concentrations. If you can imagine that we go out and we take a soil sample and we send it to the lab to be analyzed for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and petroleum hydrocarbons, because we know that's what was used at this site historically, and those were potentially released to the environment. Well, we get a list back from a laboratory, and it has a list of chemicals about this long. Some of them have 50, 60 different chemicals in there. We review that information. There's a table in the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, that's a promulgated regulation. We compare the results that we got in our soil samples to that table. If one of ours is higher, we notify Mass DEP. That's how we get into the MCP, and then we start moving through the MCP process to get to permanent solution. And so now once you're in, the process it's a phased process. They call them phase reports. Every time you come out and you report each phase of an MCP site, you start with phase one, and phase one is a tier classification step. And I think we talked about this last meeting. Tier classification is a process that the Mass DEP came up with to try to evaluate the level of possible exposure and risk that a certain site poses. So they look at the types of contaminants that are present, how persistent they are in the environment, how likely they are to move in the environment, the types of sensitive receptors nearby. So is there a drinking water well? Is there a sensitive ecosystem nearby? And so you put all that information into a formula, you add some numbers up, and spits out a total final number. And if you're above a certain threshold, they call that a tier 1 site. Those are the sites that they're most concerned with that might have adverse impacts on human health of the environment, and they want to keep a closer eye on it, so Mass DEP decides to have oversight over response actions at those tier 1 sites. Tier 2 sites fall below that threshold. Those are of lesser concern to Mass DEP. Those are led by the LSP. The LSP, there's no oversight from Mass DEP. The LSP makes the decisions on the most appropriate way to characterize the nature and extent of contamination, and quantify risks. And then the Mass DEP, of course, reserves the right to come back afterwards and say we didn't do a good enough job. So that's tier classification. The Buckley Mann site's a tier 2 site. After phase 1, we move to phase 2. That's the stage that we're in now. The original phase 2 investigation, remember, was 86 to 96. Now that we're back out of our permanent solution, we start back at phase 2. Comprehensive site assessment this is the point in which we go out and we collect environmental data. We try to develop a conceptual site model, and my next slide talks about conceptual site model. Keep that in mind. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to determine the nature and extent of contamination. So, what contaminants are present? Where are they present? Where have they migrated? What receptors are there? What possible human or ecological receptors could be exposed to this contamination, and are there risks? Is there risk of harm to human health or the environment? And if there is a risk of harm to human health and the environment, then you move to phase 3. And phase 3 is a remedial action plan. That's the plan where you look at a range of possible ways to address this contamination. It could go from consolidating on site and placing a cap over it, to excavation and off-site disposal, to groundwater treatment, to a whole host of things. So we look at a range of possible remedial alternatives. We assess their effectiveness, how implementable they are, and their cost. And then there's a decision made, which is the best, most effective way to protect human health and the environment. And phase 4 is how the LSP tells Mass DEP how they're going to implement the remedial action that was selected in phase 3. Now, at any point in the process, you could jump off, so you don't have to go through all 4. If the owner of the LSP can demonstrate that a condition of no significant risk of human health, safety, public welfare, and the environment can be demonstrated, then you can jump right to permanent solution. So if you do a phase 2, a risk assessment is part of a phase 2. If there's no significant risk, that's the MCP terminology, then you can move to permanent solution. If you run through to phase 3 and you evaluate, and for some reason you find out that you don't have a significant risk, you can jump off at phase 3. It doesn't happen very often, but at any point, if you can demonstrate that you have a condition of no significant risk, you can move on to a permanent solution. Talked about conceptual site model. It's a really important part of the phase 2, and really I wrote a definition up here. It's a little cumbersome. I think the second bullet is a little bit more succinct. Talks about we're trying to tell the story about what happened at the site. What was the source of contamination? How was that contamination released to the environment? What were the pathways that it took to travel from where it was released to where it ultimately came to rest? And then finally, how will human receptors or ecological receptors be exposed to this contamination, and will it poses risk to them. So to really boil it down, how and where do the chemicals enter the environment? Where have they traveled? Are there significant risks to human health of the environment? And so we take all the information that we collect during phase 2 and we build a conceptual site model that tells the story about how the contamination made it to where it is and whether it poses a risk. And at the end of phase 2, we need to have answers to all 3 of these questions here. And if we want to achieve a permanent solution, then the answer to that last one has to be no. Something important that I want to add too is that receptor part at the end is really the key to whether we need to take action or whether an owner or an LSP needs to take action to do remediation. So if you have contamination and there's no receptor, then there's no risk. And there's no legal reason to take a cleanup action. If you have levels of contamination that are present but they're below a certain level and the risk is no significant risk, then the MCP doesn't require you to take a cleanup action. So it's just an important interplay that I want to point out, that it's really all about receptors, right? Because just because there's a pollutant in the environment doesn't concern us as much as is that pollutant causing a risk of harm to human health or the environment. That's really what we're driving at with the phase 2. So here we are. Let's get into the plan a little bit. And I'm going to keep referring back to conceptual site model and some of the site history as we go through this. So just to orient people a little bit, this is the dye house. These are the lagoons, the dye house lagoons, 1, 2, and 3. And the carbonizer building was here. This is the carbonizer trench and the carbonizer lagoon. Here's area number 10. So we talked about the 2 processes. The dye house process was the first one that we mentioned. And so this might be hard to see. I was hoping it could be easy to see. But what I just put up there was sediment or soil samples in the 2 lagoons. This is what we have planned. We plan to go right to the spot. We're going to bias our samples to the we believe are the most contaminated areas, potentially contaminated areas on the site. This is directly where the wastewater was disposed when the facility was operating. So we're going to look at these 2 lagoons, and we're going to collect samples. We're going to evaluate those samples will be analyzed for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, heavy metals, and petroleum hydrocarbons, as those are the contaminants of concern for the site. We will review that data. If we find contaminants that are above the reportable concentrations, we'll do some more sampling. We'll go back out there and we'll try to delineate how widespread this is with a goal of characterizing the average concentration of each of our chemicals in this area here so that we can come up with an exposure point concentration. That's the concentration that we would expect somebody that occupies this area might come into contact with. So the way risk assessment models work is a receptor here that occupies this space isn't going to go to necessarily the highest contaminated area every time. They will pretty much come into contact randomly with all the sample points in those lagoons. And so we'll typically take the average of those concentrations and assume that's the average exposure for individuals that occupy that space. So you can see we'll start with 4 samples, and then we will evaluate the results of those 4 samples, and then we will go further if we need to go further. We added a couple in lagoon number 3. Lagoon number 3 was reportedly never received wastewater from the dye house, but we're going to look there anyway. So we will take 2 samples there. We'll analyze for the same tests as for the other lagoons. And again, if we find something there, we will do additional sampling. I'm calling them contingent samples here in this drawing. So you can see we should have pretty nice coverage through those lagoons. It should give us a decent idea of what's there and permit us to evaluate human health and ecological risks. Where do I go next? So soil sampling. Okay, so continuing on our conceptual model, we're telling the story How did the facility operate during its day? Well, they directed wastewater to these lagoons, and then periodically, once a decade it seems like, they would dredge these lagoons because they needed more space for wastewater, and they would place the dredge spoils into piles to the south of Lagoon number 1 here. So these piles were removed during the late 90s and consolidated into the Area 10 where the cap was placed. There were never samples collected beneath those piles to demonstrate that all the contamination was removed. So we plan to go back and collect a couple of samples from each of those piles. Let's see what's there. Let's verify that what was removed was adequate. And if not, then we'll take action to address it. I just threw up some blue circles. These are really hard, even smaller, but I want to point out the samples that were collected in March and April of 2018. And so that did a pretty good job of characterizing the extent of contamination in the carbonizer trench and the carbonizer lagoon. But there were a couple spots where we didn't quite get to the levels that we wanted to see. We didn't quite find the edge of contamination. So we call it stepping out. We'll step out from these samples a little bit further to the east and further to the south. And so we're going to try to find the clean, right? So the edge of the contaminated area and get into the clean area so that we have a really good hold on the extent of contamination in the carbonizer lagoon area and in the carbonizer trench area. If those don't do it, then we have more contingent locations planned and we'll step out again. Again, we're trying to find the edge of the contamination here so that we can say with confidence that it only extends this far, right? This is our area. And that's going to inform any type of remedial decisions that we make in the future. We have, I just added blue dots. So the blue dots are here. There's 3 of them in the Mill River. These will be sediment and surface water samples in the Mill River. Step back again to our conceptual model. So we have dye house lagoons, carbonizer lagoon, consolidation in Area 10, groundwater flows in this direction, okay? So we need to evaluate whether the contaminants that are in Area 10 that were discharged to these lagoons, did it leach into groundwater and travel this way to affect the Mill River? We intend to find that out. We have one spot that's down, right downstream from the carbonizer lagoon. We have a spot here that's downstream from Area 10, and then we have a spot up here. And this spot is right downstream of the dam, and we don't expect that this would have been impacted by site operations. The groundwater flows this way, and all of our site activity was over here. We're going to use this point right here to see if there's anything in the background, anything that's that's upstream here that could possibly be flowing into the Mill River here, so we can distinguish between, okay, there are chemicals in the Mill River, but did those chemicals come from Buckley and Mann, or did those chemicals come from someplace upstream? So we have a location here. We've also got 2 spots in Bush Pond, one of them down here by the former dye house, one of them right at the foot of the carbonizer trench. Those will be sediment and surface water samples. Again, we're looking for potential impacts from historical operations at Buckley and Mann, and we have a 3rd one planned on the other side of Lawerence Street in Bush Pond for the same objective as this sample up by the dam. We want to be able to draw a distinction between chemicals that are in the pond because of the historical operations at Buckley and Mann versus chemicals that are present either from nature, runoff from roadways, other upstream sources, industry. That things happen. These waterways, we have a very industrialized region of the country. There's I don't want to say natural background, anthropogenic background that's present in most rivers and streams in Massachusetts, and so we want to make sure that we distinguish that contamination from site-related contamination. And the last dots I put up are groundwater wells. These are existing groundwater wells. So we've got soil, sediment, surface water, and groundwater as our 4th medium. And so what we have is, we are looking for, did the material placed into these lagoons leach into groundwater and impact groundwater? Again, this will be another check, looking for not where was our contamination released, how did it travel? So we're trying to understand how it traveled through the environment and whether it impacted surface water bodies, groundwater and surface water bodies. And the surface water bodies are really key because they are, that can carry chemicals downstream, and there are a lot of environmental receptors in those surface water bodies. Let's see what I have here. So, next steps. So today, September 4th, is we're releasing the draft Phase 2 Scope of Work document. There are copies here. I'm pleased to see that they're all gone, and everybody has a copy, I hope. If you don't, this was posted on the Mass DEP's website, eDEP. I have a link to it coming up here. It'll be in the, it'll be on the slide in a second. And it's placed in the library here and in the library in Franklin if you want to look at hard copies. This will kick off a 20-day public comment period, much like we just did for the public involvement plan. That expires on the 24th of September. And then there's 30 days in there for us to come back with a response summary and then to come up with develop the final Phase 2 plan. That response summary will provide our responses to your comments and then discuss any changes to the plan that we've made in response to the public comments. So that's a statutory 30 days. We may try to accelerate that if we can, and hope to get out in the field in mid to late October to do these field investigations, and then we figure later in the year take a look at that data, do some data reduction, the risk analysis, and then we really can't predict what happens after that. We need to see what the data says, and we're going to go where the data takes us. Here's the website. If it's not easy to write down, but if you search for MCP searchable sites, on Google, you'll end up you'll finding a link that you can click on. This is the real key here when you get to that site is the RTN, the release tracking number, is 2-3000173. I spoke about the release tracking number. That's what Mass DEP uses to track these files. And if you go to their reportable release file viewer and enter that RTN, you'll find all the historical site files, including the files that the draft files that we put out for public review. So if you want to go there to get a copy of this, you can certainly do that. It's up there. It went up this morning. Oops. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to go back. I got a little trigger happy. Look at that. There it is. Sorry. Give people a minute to take a picture. Yeah. Can you take a question? Yeah, give me a couple minutes, and then we'll take questions. We did invite Paul McManus here today, and I mentioned the activity and use limitation, the audit, and the major finding of that audit was the lack of an adequate environmental risk characterization, and so that's really what's triggered this site to go back out of permanent solution and back into the MCP to Phase 2, and so. I thought it would be informative for us to share with you a little bit about the environmental risk characterization process in the MCP, and so I asked Paul if he could talk for a couple of minutes and just share that with you, because it's really an interesting part of our field, and it's something that I have a very hard time explaining, and I rely on technical experts like Paul to handle that stuff. So Paul, I'm gonna.
Thank you. Again, my name's Paul McManus. I'm actually an ecologist by background. I happen to be an LSP, but I'm also a professional wetland scientist certified. And I bring those two areas into what really a relatively narrow part of the MCP, which, as Steve said, is the risk to the environment, or we tend to use the term the eco-risk, risk to ecological receptors. So the environmental risk characterization in the MCP is a two-stage process. The first stage really involves identifying the environmental receptors on a site. Those environmental receptors are surface water, sediment, and undeveloped soil. And I make the distinction about undeveloped soil because soil that's under a parking lot and even soil that's under a developed piece of the landscape, a lawn, is not considered by the MCP to be an environmental receptor. So we have, again, surface water is obviously the pond, it's the river, it's water, it's surface water in the wetlands, it can be an intermittent stream. Sediment is defined as any of the substrate below the bank of a pond or stream. The MCP actually refers specifically to the Massachusetts wetland regulations. So there is some real linkage between those two sets of regulations in defining sediment. And then, as I said, anything that's above the sediment boundary is considered soil. And in terms of ecological risk, we look at undeveloped soil. So it can be a forested wetland, a forested upland, et cetera. Those are all our ecological media. So we're concerned with the ecological media and also with the plant and animal communities that inhabit those media. So as part of the stage 1 environmental risk characterization, we identify those media, we identify those communities that might be affected. And again, so we're looking at the site in general. We take a kind of step back, take a 10,000-foot view. Okay, we have the industrial buildings and et cetera that you saw in Steve's photo. But the setting of those, obviously, as I'm sure most of you know, is that those lagoons, for example, are in the woods. So those are ecological receptors. We have the pond, we have the river, et cetera. So part of the sampling plan, all those little dots on the figure, those are intended to go and get chemical concentrations of the range of things that history and past data suggest might be there. It's a fairly conservative list. We look at all those potential contaminants of concern. We get concentrations in those various media. And then in the stage 1, we compare those to screening standards. And the screening standards are, by design, conservative. And it's a little bit like when you go to the doctor and you get a blood test and there's a range of values. And if your concentration of your cholesterol in your blood is over a certain threshold, it causes the doctor to say, okay, we need to look at this a little further. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're about to have a heart attack. It doesn't necessarily mean anything like that, but it's a conservative standard. We compare to those. If our concentrations in those media, and we have different concentrations that we compare to, somewhat analogous to Steve's description of the reportable concentrations, where we have tables, not quite so straightforward in all cases, but we compare to those standards. If we're below those standards, which again are designed to be conservative, then with respect to ecological receptors, we're comfortable that we don't have a risk relative to a particular contaminant of concern. And again, we have to look at the whole list. If we do exceed one or more of those standards in a particular medium, then we need to look at it further. We need to do more work. It means we can't, based on that data, we can't reach a conclusion of no significant risk. Because as he said, the requirement in the MCP is that there be no significant risk, in my context, risk to the environment. So if we can't conclude no significant risk in stage 1, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have a problem. It doesn't necessarily mean we have significant risk to the environment, but it means we can't kind of say we're good to go. We need to look at it more. We need to do something. Sometimes do something means we have an exceedance of a standard in a localized area. Sometimes rather than go and do a detailed assessment of is this really a problem, we just clean it up and we deal with it and we don't ask the question. We don't ask the question in any more detail. We say, look, we have an issue, we have exposure, we have environmental medium. Let's just make that go away by cleaning it up. At other times, we go into a stage 2 environmental risk characterization. And stage 2 is a much more site-specific, very science-based. There's a lot of different things we can do in stage 2, depending upon whether we have an exceedance in surface water, whether we have it in soil, whether we have it in sediment, the nature of the contaminant. As Steve said, there's a few different things. There's a handful of different things that we're looking for out there. So there's a number of different things that we can do in stage 2, and it really depends. It really depends on what we find, how much we find, where we find it, what are those receptors. So it's you know, that's really kind of a very case-specific determination and study that one really caters very much to a site. No stage 2 environmental risk characterization looks like another one. That much I can say for sure. So very briefly, that's where we're at. We have you know, we have data to collect. I worked with the team to develop the sampling plan. I've been out to the site. I've poked around. I have an understanding of what's there. Definitely had input in you know, where those samples will be collected and how, and you know, look forward to getting that and trying to figure out what it all means and relative to those standards. So back to you.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Paul. That's, yeah, certainly I couldn't do that. I also want to, just want to say that Paul will be out there with us, part of the, when we pick our sampling locations, because part of the art of ecological risk assessment is really looking in the right places. So if you're in a, for instance, if you're in a fast-moving stream and sediment tends not to settle out in fast-moving parts of streams, it tends to settle out on curves when the water slows down, and sediment tends to stay in those locations, and that fine-grained sediment is really where contaminants tend to bind and they tend to have greater exposures. So it's important to, from that perspective, that you have somebody with Paul's expertise to make sure that we're looking in the right spots and that we're doing the proper due diligence to make sure that we're really characterizing the risk of harm to the environment. So I'm happy to take questions now. This gentleman had one first. If you still want to ask your question.
I was going to say the last slide that you had showed monitoring wells, but this document doesn't.
That might be. Yeah, that's a good comment. That might be the first comment, and well, I'll certainly add those to the next one. That's an oversight. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, why are you limiting the depth of your sampling in the pond sediment to 6 inches?
Do you want to answer that, Paul? Yeah, we'll take one.
The question was, why are we limiting sampling depth in the pond to 6 inches? 6 inches is really what we refer to as the biologically available sediment. And that's the sediment that the critters in the pond would be exposed to. Sediment that's buried deeper below that may have contamination. Let me rephrase. If there's a situation where there's sediment more than 6 inches down, it's really not an exposure point for those critters. So that's where there's been a lot of work done in this issue, primarily by United States EPA, and that's their recommendation.
Well, you know, this pond has probably been, we know it's 100 years it's been used. There's been a certain level of sedimentation on that. So at this point, if you go down 6 inches and you give an okay, you have no idea what's below that. What prevents somebody from coming in and dredging that pond to make it deeper in the future, or put a sandy bottom in there so it can be used for swimming and stir up a whole slew of stuff? You have no idea what's there.
Well, if somebody were to propose to dredge the pond, there's a protocol in DEP regulations for, before you can get a permit to dredge, you need to characterize that sediment. So and one of the reasons for doing that is to make sure that every dredging project doesn't create a problem and resuspend dirty sediments in the event that they happen to be there. And again, that applies to every every dredging permit.
If I could add to that, is that, and so then as a result, the permit for that dredge would look deeper. So now we have a potential exposure to historical contamination here, and you're going to now expose a new layer of sediment that wasn't otherwise available, and so the burden for that permit would be greater and deeper to ensure that that's an acceptable action. And then if I could build on the environmental point to talk a little bit about human health, is certainly we wouldn't expect to have very much exposure to, if we look at site-specific exposure to sediment deeper than 6 inches in that pond either. So again, it's a situation where if there are contaminants deeper than 6 inches, it's unlikely that any living thing will be exposed to that sediment. So again, it's something that's outside of that cleanup universe. And then actually, while we're talking about it, is that natural sedimentation process that you referred to is sometimes how the environment cleans itself up. Over time, things become less accessible in sediment as water flows in and sediment settles out. And so I guess that's the Earth's way of sometimes naturally making things less accessible to both human and ecological receptors. So sometimes the remedies for sediment are a little bit tricky because you're faced with that whole, the idea of, do we want to go back and disturb this sediment and then possibly stir up some old historical industrial contamination, or do we want to leave it the way it is because it's now buried under natural sedimentation? And that's a very common problem. You can imagine in urban areas in our state that there's a lot of historical industry along riverways that's been long abandoned, and now you've got years and years of sedimentation, and there's that quandary about whether it's worth going aggressively out to clean it up, pick it all out, or to let nature take its course.
Do you have to do more testing before you do pile driving in a pond scenario?
Certainly.
I had a couple of questions. I was wondering, back to the tier classification, was this site always a tier 2, and was that ever revisited at this point, the tier classification, or are we just sticking with the tier 2 that it's always been?
It's always been a tier 2. There are some tier 1 criteria that have to be met. One of those is if you have groundwater contamination above a reportable concentration that's within a zone 2. Some people know about that, some people don't know what that means, and we haven't found that yet. So it remains tier 2, right? We're not reclassifying to 1.
I just, where the Franklin wells are on the property now and things like that.
It is in a zone 2 of a potentially protective aquifer, which means it's in a region that is, I would say, within the potential of that, or it's mapped as a potential aquifer. I don't know that it's connected to the Franklin wells. I'm not a hydrogeologist. I don't believe it. But let's just say it's a protected. It's identified by Mass DP as something that's protected. So if there is groundwater contamination, then that might qualify it as a tier 1.
Okay, so we could go back to phase 1 if you found something.
Yeah, you would reclassify as tier 1 if something were found.
Okay, that's what and was also wondering that the foundations, I know there's really no testing being done near or around them, and
Yep.
I just had my concern based on the time frame they were poured that, I know asbestos was used in foundation work in those years.
Yeah, we've it's not shown on this figure here. It's not shown on this map, unfortunately. I didn't also put it into the phase 2 scope of work document. Maybe I should. I'll take that suggestion. But there's been quite a bit of investigation in this area, and what she's referring to is the former, these foundations that still exist. And there was a lot of exploration there, and whose primary intent was to determine if there were any floor drains or subsurface drains in this area that might have been conduits for contaminants to enter the environment. None were found. But during that work, there were, I'm not sure it was 20, but it was somewhere in that area, 20 soil samples that were collected from this area. All of them were analyzed for metals. A portion of them were analyzed for PAHs, and really not very much was found there. So we're feeling pretty good that the area around here is pretty well characterized, and there's not much there by way of contamination. We have The dye house and the carbonizer spot, those were our two processes that produced wastes. The historical information that we have indicates that these other buildings here, the bigger buildings off the map here, they never processed any chemicals. So we feel pretty good that we've got this area characterized, and you can see we're not proposing any additional soil sampling at the moment. Yes.
The document here says that you're also taking soil sediment samples and co-located surface water samples from the tail race, but they're not on your.
Yeah, okay, I didn't mention the tail race. Thank you. So the yellow dots that are shown here are in the tail race. Yeah. And I skipped right over that, so thank you very much for mentioning that. We do, so this is the story with the tail race was a part of a hydroelectric power generating system that was on the site. It took water from Bush Pond, passed through a water wheel, and then back to the Mill River to the north of the site here. And we've talked about in previous meetings, there's evidence there that there's some contamination in the tail race. So certainly we have, it's down gradient, we call it downstream, but down gradient for groundwater of the lagoons here. And so we've proposed some further sampling in the tail race, sediment and surface water if it's there, looking for PAHs, metals, petroleum hydrocarbons as well. We're also going to evaluate pH. pH is a measure of the acidity of that water and could possibly be an explanation for why that rust-colored flock is forming. So yes, indeed, that's part of the investigation. I just failed to mention it as I was going through step by step. There are 3 spots. We've got one that's down gradient from Lagoon 2, one down gradient from Lagoon 1, and then down where closer to the inlet here. There were 4 samples collected from the tail race previously. I think those were done in March. And so we have results from those, and nothing exceeded, but we're going back here to look a little bit more fully at it, tail race. Thank you, good comment. Yes?
I have a question about the carbonizer lagoon. You have some new suggestions of sampling happening further and further away to try to get down to essentially a background concentration of some contaminants. But what about the center of the lagoon itself? It seems like most of your sampling has been essentially around the perimeter of the lagoon. But are you planning to also kind of go dead center and look at what the soils have there, both in terms of solids, but also in terms of groundwater?
We have some in the center, and we have some with pretty high concentrations too. I think we feel like we've found the center of mass in the middle. So right now we don't have anything else planned for the interior of the carbonizer lagoon, but we will collect surface water if surface water is there. I mean, that's I believe at this point that's groundwater expressing itself at the ground surface or close to the ground surface. So that'll give us a sense for whether or not this stuff is in the groundwater. But we don't have anything planned for the middle. We have quite a bit in here. If you go back and look at some of the stuff that was done in March and April, we've got a pretty decent coverage throughout this area here, and we've got some high concentrations. So I think we feel like we've hit the, what should I say, the center of where the source would be in the carbonizer lagoon.
But in terms of groundwater, which you expect to have a maximum impact sort of in the geographical center of the lagoon, and below the lagoon itself. As far as I know, you don't have any samples at all of groundwater underneath the lagoon.
Yeah, no, we don't. We don't. That's something we'll have to think about. With respect to the center of the lagoon, Peter's been in and out of there more than I have, but I believe that the center of the lagoon actually is where I think they took some material from the outsides of the lagoon and piled some towards the middle when they were trying to make space. So it may be that preferentially some of the wastewater was actually not in the center, but at, sort of a, donut shaped on the outside. But your point about the groundwater is a good one. It's something we're gonna have to think about. Yes?
Is it, you can go first. I have a number of questions. I can wait.
So you're comfortable with the testing that was done on the foundations around there? You come into this project 3 months ago. We have an LSP that gave us a report saying the testing was basically inadequate because it was down 6 to 9 inches and was not reviewed by an LSP. And as a licensed professional with no integrity for this data, you're saying you're comfortable. To me, you're a little cavalier up there talking about what I consider a huge problem, bracing over it's like it's nothing. And this fellow here with the environmental, you still have to answer the question why some of the most pristine land in Norfolk, with streams and ponds and woodland, is devoid of most wildlife. That has to be answered. There's a reason that we don't know it yet. When did you decide that you were testing on your own? I say this to Tommy too, because I've worked in this project for 3 years, and up to this point, pretty collaboratively trying to get this thing done right. We had an agreement here that this testing was going to be done, location, what we're testing for, in concert with our LSP. Your testing setup is extremely less inclusive than his. So you're taking on a path on your own, deciding where you're going to test, what you're going to test for, and we hired our professional who has a vast disagreement in many areas, and you're ignoring it. And I say the credibility of Tommy himself, before these town boards, some under testimony, that this place was safe. And to this day, until you come in, or actually until the conservation called the DEP and said, these areas should be tested. Look at these pictures we're sending you. Well, that's when you first came in. Because before that, we were told there was an LSP and one checking one, and there was none. There is no integrity of your data. So you go off on a tangent, and you're going to decide where you're going to test, and you're going to go down 6 inches here and 4 inches there and take 2 tests here and average them. This is going to be done as far as the town's concerned with the cooperation of our LSP, and this isn't just a project issue, this is a town issue. There has to be consensus from the people in this town that represent the residents on how this is going to be remedied, and first of all, what the issue is and what degree. And that's both vertically and horizontally. Because I'll tell you, if you think that you're going to take a whole bunch of gravel out of here and leave the contaminated stuff there, I think you made a big miscalculation. So my suggestion to you and to Tom is to get a little frank, come up with a consensus plan, bring it to the town officials, decide where we're testing, how far we're going to dig down and test, rather than just 6 inches or where you choose, and come up with a comprehensive plan. That was the game plan from day one when we brought you in, when Tom was in the meeting, with his attorney and the selectmen, etc. And now it seems to have gone adrift. And I sit here, your testing report, matching it up to Weston and Sampson, it's offensive. For someone that's put so many hours in this project, this is an offensive report. There's danger there. And there's reasons why there's not damn one tree frog that's clicking out there when you go through acres and acres of woodland. There's a problem. We don't know what it is, but there's a problem. So I suggest that you might regroup, get together with our guy, follow the plan that we set up months and months ago, and let's get this thing done right and get it done completely.
Okay, thanks for your comment. Okay, I appreciate your comment. We have collaborated with the town's LSP, and I urge you to really sit down and look at the recommendations that were made by the town's LSP and compare them to what we're proposing, and in a concrete manner. Present it.
Why don't you let him speak? I spoke with him before the meeting.
Okay, I will let him speak, but if you called into question my integrity, then I will speak first.
I'm calling into question the path that you're proceeding on. It was not what we agreed.
And I suggest that we're on. Well, there's more common ground than you
The
represent.
third party in this whole thing was the town who's going to oversee.
Okay, Frank, do you want to say a word? Thanks. Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Everyone, I'm Frank Riccardi with Weston and Sampson, and I'm the LSP for the town to review the cleanup of this property. I did collaborate with Steve. We did meet. We compared our reports and what they're planning to do. I think that the developer's LSP has a more iterative approach on how they're going to sample and clean up the site. John, your points are well taken. We know this is a very concerned community. I think that Steve is a very good LSP, and he's not going to jeopardize his license. I think that with our involvement and with the town's comments and with Dave and very concerned citizens group, we're going to have very many comments on the scope of work. I looked and I had about 30 additional samples to improve spatial coverage as well as depth and vertical extent. And I have very many comments that I would give to Steve, and that's the process that we take in this. So eventually, with our involvement and your involvement, we're going to get to a scope of work that meets the criteria for the regulation, that addresses the conceptual site model, the fate and transport, the extent of the contamination, and we're going to comment on the remedial action plan as well. So we're going to be involved. This is the beauty of the PIP plan. There's a process for you to comment, for me to comment, for the town to comment. Very active community group. I'm sure Dave's going to have some comments as well. And we're going to work together to make sure this is done appropriately. Now, as far as my comments go, I do have some questions, and one since Paul is here. Steve had said earlier that LSPs have a duty to report imminent hazards. One thing that I've observed walking around, I'd like to get Paul's opinion, is the flocculant, the iron staining on the surface water, because that could be conceived as a readily apparent harm. And I don't know what you're an LSP and an ecological risk assessor. Have you looked at it in terms of that flock and readily apparent harm to the environment? Pass the mic.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I have seen the flock. I've seen flock like that in a number of cases. I am familiar with the DEP PowerPoint where your photo, I'm pretty sure, came from. The flock is one of those things, as I said, that occurs in many instances for a number of reasons and to varying degrees. And frankly, I just disagree with the statement that the presence of flock represents an imminent hazard to the environment. I think, like a lot of things, any sort of contaminant at a certain level rises to the level of reportable and can rise to the level of an imminent hazard. I think, frankly, I only just recently became aware of that PowerPoint from DEP, and I have not had a chance to, but I fully intend to talk to Greg Braun, who's one of the authors of that, and ask him about that. It's interesting, in that same PowerPoint, he has, somewhat as a joke, but one of his I think he has a picture of, I think he's calling it overt evidence of harm, is where a beaver apparently cut down a tree and dropped it on himself and killed himself. Another picture he has, he talks about fish kills. I've seen a fish kill that looks very much like the one in the picture several times, and it's from when the bluefish or striped bass chase the menhaden up into an estuary, run it out of oxygen and all those, and you get thousands of menhaden die. I'm pretty sure that's what his picture is. So I really think it's frankly inappropriate for him to be calling those things MCP, imminent hazard to the environment, because obviously his beaver picture is somewhat in jest and clearly so, but the other one with the fish, I think, is an entirely natural condition. So frankly, I don't accept that characterization, and I have every intention of talking to DEP about it.
Are you saying that we have striped bass in this pond, or that fish kill was caused by striped bass?
No, that was a DEP PowerPoint on ecological risk. So
Was it freshwater or saltwater, the fish killing?
I think Paul had said that the bluefish had run the smaller fish into surface water that was fresh, and they had to kill. So I have a lot of, I want to keep addressing John's comments because it gets to the root of the matter. The Phase 2 scope of work, since you're essentially reopening the Phase 2 and you talk about a conceptual site model, one of my comments will be to have a conceptual site model in the scope of work so that we can verify the sources and the sampling associated with the sources so that we can put those two and two together. Because there's very many concerns, as I'm sure you will hear, about areas of the site that have never been investigated, spatial coverage, as I had commented. And we had met 2 days ago to go over these two scopes of work. We agreed to disagree in some areas, but that's what happens with a privatized program. My opinion, Steve's opinion, could be different. And we have to arrive on something that's protective to human health and the environment. So, yes, sir.
Frank, I would have preferred, as we had agreed upon before, that before we have a plan of testing, that your comments were put into this, they were incorporated in this plan, they were reviewed with the town, with everybody involved to make sure that everybody's on the right path. No one's here to disparage anybody's character or personality. The point is to try to get this thing right, because for 20 years, something's wrong. So we've got cadmium and cadmium in one spot that's chromium, I'm sorry. One spot that's 3 times the allowed level. No one has decided yet whether that's chromium 3 or 6. I come to find out the town stopped testing for chromium in 2011. So wouldn't it be a horror if that chromium was going into the Mill River, which is our aquifer that's going into the water source? So right now the testing is being done to see if that is in fact the case. Hopefully it's not. This is a serious problem. And there's a lot of different things going on all over that place that were ignored in the initial AUL filing. And we got to come up with consensus. If you're both good, then that makes it even better. Come together, go for an independent party, which is the town officials, and then go on your plan of attack and find out what's out there. Finally, once and for all.
Yep, and that's the whole intent of this process. And there's going to be even more comments from the public. And I just wanted to come up and say that we did meet, that we had we do disagree in some areas, but the approach where we disagree is to do some initial testing, see what's there, and then go out from that point instead of collecting very many samples at the beginning like I had. Okay. And I'm going to step away. I do have more comments, but I'm going to put them in writing per the process unless people want to ask me specifically about questions. So thank you. Steve.
Thanks, Rick. Thank you. You covered a lot there. I just want to say something about the chromium 6s. We do have a subset of our chromium data speciated to hexavalent chromium, and all the evidence points to there not being a significant percentage of hexavalent chromium. We haven't found one hexavalent chromium concentration above 100, which is the reportable concentration for hexavalent chromium. So right now, this is a chromium site, no doubt, not a hexavalent chromium site. So the most toxic hexavalent chromium, which is it's a dangerous thing, haven't found it here above reportable concentration, so it won't be a risk driver. If the risk assessment went today, it would not be a risk driver. So it's present, yes, it's present below reportable. There are high concentrations of chromium, yes, but that's predominantly chromium 3. Yes.
I have a number of questions. I want to know if you personally tested the foundations.
I did
or
not.
is that something that was reported to you?
That was reported to me.
Okay. So you feel comfortable based on someone else reporting to you?
It happens a lot where I have to rely on previous consultants' data.
Was that an LSP, the person who reported to you previously?
I'd have to look. That's a question for Tom and others that did it.
I mean, it really matters. That's a significant question.
We received that comment on the public involvement plan, and all that data will be provided. All those data reports will be provided, and then who is responsible for collecting those samples will be provided as well.
Right, because if I tested it, it wouldn't matter. That's my point. So if it's not an LSP, it's invalid data, right? Is that correct?
That's not necessarily, no. That doesn't mean it's not valid data if it's not an LSP.
The Conservation Commission asked for the mapping and the data reports of all the testing in those foundations 4 months ago, and received nothing. Told them we're not.
Okay. Are there other questions?
Yeah, I have plenty of questions. So the other questions also were, how is the mill powered?
I believe it was powered by hydro at one point, but there were, I don't know, were the petroleum tanks for, did they get power from? Or was that heating or was that electric? I'm not completely sure.
How does hydro work?
I'm not an electrician.
Is there a mechanical system that works with it? That's what I'm sort of asking.
A mechanical system? I mean, there needs to be a turbine to generate electricity. That's about the extent of my electrical knowledge.
Is there a wheel involved?
I believe there's a water wheel historically.
So I guess my question to follow up on that is, it sounded like you made the pond sound like the water would only go in one direction from the pond down the river. But if there's a wheel involved, wouldn't the water go back into the pond as well? Wouldn't there be a transference of the water back and forth between the two waterways?
The way I understand that hydroelectric system would work would be you'd have a difference in elevation between the Bush Pond here and the river where it intercepted up here that would drive a water flow this way. And that's the actual driving force for the water wheel, which spins the turbine, which generates electricity. So it would be one way.
It goes one way, the water knows to go one way, it knows not to go back into the pond.
The water flows downhill.
Okay, so there's a proposed boathouse, right?
I don't know about the boathouse. I'm an LSP and I know about dirt and groundwater and what's contaminated in it and whether that's a risk to humans or the environment. And the future development is, we're talking about MCP issues here, and that future development I think is for another committee or another meeting.
No, but my question is, do you think that would be a good idea if you find contamination in the pond?
Certainly, the risk assessment, the human health risk assessment will evaluate potential future uses of the property, and certainly will recognize that there's going to be a residential development nearby with possible recreational opportunities in the pond, yes.
So another question about transference of water. Over that course of those years, would there ever be flooding? And would that water, the transference of water, ever go back and forth between the pond and the water going the other direction towards the river?
I suppose that could happen, sure.
I think that'd be pretty likely, right?
It could happen. I don't know whether it's likely or not.
Okay. And then the other thing is, can I ask you where you get your historical data on this site?
We have information that was from the initial phase 2. A lot of it's from there. We have had, as is common in our industry, we talk to the current owners and the prior operators and get information from them on what happened on the site. So those types of data, we look at historical maps. We look at that covers the gamut of it.
So have you spoken with people who are operators on that site?
I haven't personally, no, but our team has, yeah.
So we could find out who those people would be?
Yeah.
That would be great information.
Okay.
You said earlier that the site started in the late 1800s. According to the Historical Society, it started in the early 1800s.
Okay.
It also operated a tannery, a felt mill, and a paper mill. Were you aware of that?
No, I'd like to see that. If you could submit that as a comment and the information for that. The only thing I'm aware of is reviewing topographic maps back into the 1800s was that there was nothing on this land that was on a topographic map before the late 1800s. So.
Tax records apparently back up there being a mill there.
Okay.
Thank you. Oh, can I ask one other question? Have you found any buried lagoons and have you tested any of those?
Okay. Thanks, Dave. Okay. No, haven't found any buried lagoons. These are the lagoons that that are shown on historical plans, historical photos, and that were part of the operation as it was described to not only us but the prior consultant too. So these are the lagoons we've found.
So there's a lot of wooded areas. Will it show all lagoons necessarily?
We can only go by the information that we have about what was operated here. So we've done due diligence on that. Standard practice for environmental assessment work. We've gone and reviewed historical records. We've talked to prior owners and operators, and this is how we understand the process worked. And these are the locations where we've identified waste disposal. And so that's there's a standard for that, the due diligence for that, and we've met that standard.
There's quite a distance between the lagoons themselves and the back of the dye house, for instance. How is the water or the waste conveyed to there?
Yeah.
Is there plenty time for testing that intermediate area?
So there was a trench that went between the dye house and the lagoons here. That trench was was dug out and filled with clean fill when they closed those lagoons, which was, I don't know the time frame exactly, but no, we don't have plans to test those right now.
Interesting.
You said that like in the 1900s, they would fill those lagoons, area 2 and 1, and then they would dredge them every so many years.
Yep.
To do it, they piled it up in the areas 3, 5, and 6.
Correct,
I
yeah.
mean, that's like an 80-year span. I mean, those would be huge mounds over time when you do dredging. I mean, how do we know they didn't move that dirt to someplace else on the site? I mean, so there could be, you know, dirt buried someplace else, and if that's taken away, now you're taking away contamination.
I mean, it's possible that they could have consolidated here. I mean, all the historical information we have about how they operated on this site was that they left piles here from these lagoons, and then this is where they consolidated solid waste that was generated by the facility in Area 10.
I would just think 80 years worth of dredging, those would be gigantic. Piles of dirt.
Well, remember, you have a liquid waste stream, and it has fine that settle out of it, but
I'm just thinking, because, you know, if you had to remove all that dirt and put it into Area 10, so it had to be a good amount of dirt. It wasn't like just, you know, scoops.
Steve, have you interviewed any folks in town that worked at the plant?
I haven't. I haven't, but I think Tom's talked to folks extensively about what went on at the plant, what their processes were.
Independent person. I think independent person talking to them would be better.
Are there very many folks that are still in
Not
town
sure
that
if we would know.
worked at the plant, historic?
No, it's been a
I don't-
I think you have to look at the tax record probably and see that. I wouldn't be surprised. There's got to be some people alive from the 70s and 80s that work there.
They're keeping my age.
That's right.
Yeah, very young, 56. There are some people that work there.
Yeah.
Where does the historical data come from? That's sort of the heart of my question. Where do you get that? I know you said pictures, but what else? Interviews from who?
So there's, the owners have provided information on our process, not just now, but also in the 90s when they did the original Phase 2 work, and a lot of that's documented in the Permanent Solution Report that was put out in 2001. And you can look at historical photographs, you can look at historical topographic maps, and you know, outside of that, it's really interviewing other people that work there. And those are your sources of information. That's,
So something was back in the 1800s is not really something you can interview, right?
no?
So I have some questions. I'm going to stand right here next to Steve, so I have to wear the mic. First thing I want to ask is just a process thing. And I asked this, I think, at the ZBA, is to understand where we are in the process. So we submitted some information that was kind of the interviews one.
Yep.
And then we submitted some other materials.
Yep.
So the first round of submissions, it was good because in the PIP process thing we did, very structural, it was really about these are the 5 things that we received.
Yep.
So for instance, I sent in, I always go back to this when I talk to these ZBAs, we went through this with the golf course committee.
Yep.
And it was pretty helpful to actually have that. So for instance, I submitted that as kind of, you know, to get into this, but when do you address that in
So
the scope?
so
There are 5 things in there,
Yep.
which are, if you don't do these things, then you haven't done your job.
Yep.
It's not your job
Yep.
or anything,
Yeah, yeah.
it's the previous
Sure, yep.
clean crew.
Yeah. So we'll include those in our response summary for the public involvement plan.
So after that gets included,
Yep.
it'll be addressed up there?
Yep.
Is that we're going to do it or we're not going to do it? Or
Right. So this is our response to your comment. This is our rationale on and our you know, we agree or disagree with your comment.
Yeah.
Right, and that'll come up in the coming couple weeks. And then these are the changes that we intend to
Sure,
make on the
we'll
plan.
feed you information. Eric's created Google Maps,
Okay.
basically the query and his number of overlays, put some more today.
Okay.
So these reports we put in there, you can click, turn them on and off. So I think, I don't know if you're aware of that, but we have a great resource. So you don't have to comb through this documentation.
Yep.
I did have a question, because I just wanted to interact with you. It's nice to not have to say, Mr. Chairman, you know, actually do it here. So if you go back, the risk model, where you start with, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So just keep going through that whole slide, the risk model one.
Conceptual model right here.
Conceptual model, okay,
Yeah,
that's
there
the
we
one.
go, yeah.
That's the one I want
Yeah.
to understand. So if you're starting here, that's what we're doing now. And you put some, I asked about ZBA, how'd you know where to test in the carbonized lagoon? And I didn't know what 0 to 1 was. I think you did a good job. You know, you go down a foot. So I understand that, but it comes back to where did you get the information of where to test? Did that come from the owners, or did you ask them where to go test? Or did you look at it and say, you need to test on that island, that's juicy here, over there it's high in? Did you do the testing, or did you do the testing?
Peter did the testing.
You did. How many hours did you, are you familiar with the area? Oh, Pete, you did. Okay,
Yeah.
great. So you've been down and done the testing. So maybe I can just ask you, how did you determine where to put the stakes? Because it's a big area.
Basically elevation.
Oh, so you try to get every elevation? Okay. So if you did 0 to 1 and did a cut on the island, where the big tree is, for instance, you see, we got all these drone things, then that would go down 1, and you're down into the wet area, you go down to everything up by carbonized and transfer nodes. So that's helpful. Now in your report, this isn't a report that people have, it's table 2.1. It shows, I'm just going to sit here with you. It says carbonized lagoon, soil sample 10.
Yep.
We didn't see it on the last one, I asked you that, so now we're getting to it. But it says this is going to be 2 to 3 and 1 to 2 is what we're blank. Does that mean you are going to test those areas there?
So those are, this
They
is,
got a dash in them now.
we're looking at hexavalent chromium. And so we analyzed, he's a question, one of the table 2-1.
I'll show it to you.
There are some blank cells in the hexavalent chromium row.
Yeah.
And so as I mentioned, we did a subset of the chromium samples and analyzed them for hexavalent chromium. So not every sample was analyzed for hexavalent chromium. Traditionally, when you go out and do a screening of a site like this, you look for a set of 13 metals. They're regulated by the MCP. And hexavalent chromium is an extra. You don't usually look for it unless there's a suspicion that it's here. There was a suspicion it could be here based on some historical information. And so we looked at, I don't know whether it's a third or a half, but there's a subset of samples, not everyone.
Would it make sense to go, we did 0 to 1 at different elevations, would
Yep.
it make sense at different elevations, because those are blank, to go 2 to 3, or 3 to go down further to get more? Because I think, hexavalent chromiums, the Aaron Brockovich chemical, I mean, there could be a lot of concern for a long time with that.
Yeah.
And it's not great for real estate values, it's not great for the town of Water because it's adjacent to it. It's just, we'll put into the suggestions
Sure.
of something to
Yep.
do there. The other thing I wanted to ask is, the minimum risk levels that are set. Some of those go back and haven't been changed since 1991 or something. Chromium 6 was updated, as were some of the other chemicals that exceeded. But there is a measurement just at 0 to 1 in a number of locations, one of which is at 79. And
That's
I
high.
believe that's extremely high. So if you go to so let me just say it. So if you went back to the map and you read the documentation, there actually the dredging was done from the island, and then there was a dike built. And I don't think any of the testing has been in the dike. But that would be a great place to test. Again, to make sure that if you hit 100 or something, it can be dealt with. So that's an important thing. I wanted to ask now, so this is a standard process where you find a source, all right? How did it get somewhere? What is this? What's your release mechanism?
Yeah, so was it dumped? Did it go leach to groundwater? Did it run off into a surface water body?
Okay. And what's a pathway?
Pathway would be groundwater flow through air, maybe.
Okay, that's helpful. And the receptor, that could be a human with minimum risk levels.
Yep.
It could be also animal studies.
Yep.
So what I was thinking of is if we knew where there was disease that is prevalent, okay, and we looked at the disease and we said there's receptors with disease, and we kind of worked backwards, and we knew what the risk level was, then we could look at the sources and find out, for instance, chromium-6. Is there a source of chromium-6, and what was the pathway? So I asked about chromium-6 at the zoning board, and I felt a little shut down. It was like, oh, we got a PIP, and Frank's working with you, and everything. So I wanted to ask it again. We have these experts here. Could you tell me about tell us about chromium-6, and what types of health hazards are associated with it? Why is there a certain minimum risk level for it?
Well, I'm not a toxicologist, so I can't tell you specifically what organs or what part, what illnesses chromium-6 would cause. I can tell you that chromium-6 is a form of chromium that's prevalent in reducing environments. It's not very common in nature, but it is more mobile. It's more toxic and it's more mobile than chromium-3. So hence it's more dangerous. If you think about a source and a release, and if you release something that's more toxic and it's also more likely to move in the environment, then it's a greater concern. So as a result, the regulatory agencies establish lower thresholds for concern for chromium-6 than they do for chromium-3. So that's the reason why it's a more sensitive compound.
Okay, that's very helpful. So I guess here's my point. If you go, could you flip forward please to the diagram of, is this the one? If you could go to the one where you're going to do the test, kind of find one. Yeah, that's great.
Yep.
So this one up here, what's the purpose of this one right here?
Well, right here.
That blue diamond.
Right here, we want to look at what's coming in from Bush Pond past the dam, and then secondarily, we have we observe some some rust-colored material on the bank here, and this seems like a spot where there isn't likely to have been much impact from site operations. So we want to try to get to the bottom of what could be causing the rust color staining.
So that's a new test you're going to do?
We have not sampled there before, right?
That's good. And
Right.
I think that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you. If you've been down there, if you've been fishing or something, and I know you folks have done testing, I think a lot of the people who are here and who've been involved see that as something that is reportable, or at least explained to the citizens, the residents. Particularly when you have a measurement of chromium-6, where here or here, I think that's 10 right there, which is pretty darn close to the river. Actually, it was almost probably underwater when we had that big storm.
Yep.
But here's my point. I wanted to say, test there, that's great, but when you walk down here, it's oozing, sometimes as big as a twin-size mattress. And I don't know purpose of reporting. Does that get the DEP spun up? If you're going to go put in, hay bales or something. I'm not going to go any further on it, but I think it's very frustrating. A lot of angst could be diffused if tomorrow morning those started to take care of it. Okay, so that's not necessarily you. It's an observation.
Yep.
Good place to test. Okay.
So, you're referring to along this bank?
It's a Christmas up there. It's right here, and it comes from out from under the water. 3-foot trenches here, usually dry, but you can see it right there. So it's hard with some of the greenery now, but you can see it in the spring when the water was going down and flowing a lot of the dam. That's something which, we actually, I think you have it on, it is on Google Earth, on the Google Earth map, and there's the drone shots right over that. So we can get you those drone shots of it. So that was one thing. I wanted to go back to, instead of doing, I think there's some papers on this, but instead of doing this model where you go look at where the dye was, and by the way, we can get to the history of chrome dyes that were used there. Not enzo dyes, but chrome dyes, and just how much chrome dye is used there. If you said, what's the prevalence of disease and the incidence of a certain specific disease and work your way backwards, then you can think, well, this is the list, what should we be looking for? And chromium-6 might be one of them. So very first time I stood up at the first zoning board, I read into the record something that was really of great concern to me. And it was what's in the cancer registry for Massachusetts. Now, the cancer registry deals with billing codes that are reported for who pays for what types of treatments. And there's some statistics involved with them, but it's something to look at. And so I was able, through ResearchGate, to network with a couple of people who are experts in chromium-6, and I did receive a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a study of every study, and it went through 56 cohort of case-controlled studies, a wonderful historical study, so instead of searching all over for it, and I'm going to give this and work with the Board of Health on it, but at the end paragraph, there is very specifically a linkage to chromium-6 and stomach cancer. Very first time I got up, I read off the record, I read off the amounts that exceeded more than 100% of the expected amount. I said, and I went back and looked at it for a minute, and astonishingly, a 205% risk of stomach cancer. I'm saying this today because if we're going to, if money is going to be spent, let's not just look at a die, look at a minimum risk level that may have been established, I don't know when, by who, and what site, probably not based on what the water level or anything. It would be just great if we could kind of back into it and help advise the process about not just where the health hazards are, but where the human hazards have been. That would probably be something that would be very helpful, and it would, I think, alleviate a lot of concerns, especially mine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yeah.
And so another thing, in the ZBA, they call this an uncontaminated trench. And so it looks like you're going to do some more investigation of that. What's interesting, and I'll provide this to the town LSP and to you in the comments, but when the buildings came down, there's a big blow up of this. And it shows where the pipes came out of here and where the water flowed. It shows also, a backflow into the pond. But here's my point. The water came in here, it goes into the dye house, and it exits somewhere. Now, I wanted to ask you, how did the water get into the lagoons?
There was a trench from the dye house lagoons out to the lagoon.
That would be a great place to look to. Because then if we knew water was going into the dye house, this trench has been filled up. But these are all connected by pipe. But if this trench has been filled up, that would be a good place to look. Now, I know there's an area of concern here, and that's been excavated recently. But that would be another place to look. Inside the tail race, there's a lot of flock, no sheep. Over here, up where that bloom is, there's flock and sheep. So I'm trying to make 2 points here. One is look at the prevalence of disease, which we have. We can get a lot more through interview process. And then back into the most priority ones, regardless of what level they are in what's kind of a random pattern. All right, so if you went down and tested, let us say, here's the stuff to test, poke more holes, don't bother with these, or maybe you need to spend a lot more time on it. The other is investigation of this area right here. So I did 2 things. One was, when are you going to answer those questions I asked you?
Yep.
The other one is, and we can put these in the comments and provide you more information. There's more documentation about when the buildings were raised and unanswered questions about where the water flowed. And then there's another one here where the carbonizer trench was filled along here. It's kind of a jogging path along there. And you can actually see where it's been stopped off. That would be another good place to test. I know it has been tested in the last year or so. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say about it. We're providing more information. I'd like to be very transparent. We have a lot of resources. Don't spend a lot of money on resources if we can help identify things. So we put in the comments, but in the build-in rates, there's actually a pipe. It goes in. It comes out of the foundation and flows into there. It's not that big rusty iron one, but we took pictures of it when we did the site walkthrough, the first site walkthrough, and there's an opening here, it's plugged, but water flows out of it. So another area that we'll write up and give.
Okay. All right. Yep.
Okay.
Thanks for that info.
So just to
Thank-
add one more
Yeah, go ahead. I just wanted to say that you raise a lot of good points. I appreciate your input and your approach. With respect to chromium-6, again, I just want to say we're not done looking for chromium-6. I want to make sure that that's clear. We have looked for chromium-6. We haven't found anything yet that's been above reportable. And the standards are the standards. They're based on the most recent toxicology. And if the Mass DEP, we haven't found anything above a level that would cause concern by Mass DEP. I don't know an LSP that would at this point, having reviewed the data that's available today, that would raise an alarm that chromium-6 was a risk driver.
Just to point to chromium-6, the threshold level is set for total chromium at the risk number for hex chrome. So if you don't find total chromium above that level, then hex chrome is not at risk as well. Okay. So they set that total chromium number at the lowest level that would be posed by the hex chrome.
I think that's very helpful. I just wanted to pick up on something that you had said, you don't know an LSP, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But is this a budget thing? Because we've said at Selectmen's meeting, if you need funding to do more extensive testing, we'll find money. It's not a problem. So just keep that in the back of your mind.
Yeah, no.
If it makes sense and it costs $3,000 to test a chromium 6 months, well, we've got to pick the right place. Is he going to do it in 5 places to alleviate the concern because it's in the cancer incident ratios? There are a lot of other things. I didn't say in there. But that would be something, we'd like to know along the way. And we mentioned that at Selectmen's meeting too. So that's just, you don't need to tell us. I think it's kind of confidential how the funding's going, but I wanted to make that overture as quickly from this group.
I think it's important to say that we put together a plan here that we believe is going to characterize the site. I mean, there's never unlimited funds. There's always a balance between with that has to be. But this is a program that we put together almost without regard to cost to make sure that we had the site characterized. And if I had to bet, more dots will go up on here. But this is right. This is our conceptual phase 2 scope of work. If you look in the regulations, what we're tasked with doing at this point is to come up with a conceptual phase 2 scope of work. And this is where we're at right now. This is the test that we're doing, the locations that we're looking at right now, and we'll continue to collaborate with the town and town's LSP and take information from public sources because there's a lot of good information out there. So this is a give and take process. It's a process, and then before I ask for your question. I don't want people to leave here thinking that the process is broken, that it doesn't work, that Mass DEP, fell asleep at the wheel. The process actually did work. There was a decision that was made in 2001 by a consultant. That decision wasn't comprehensive enough, and eventually Mass DEP came back and audited it, which is the way the program's supposed to work, and they made findings. And now the site's being revisited, it's being relooked at with a closer eye. So the process isn't broken. This is the process. The process is to review these things periodically, and if they're not consistent with standards change. Things change over time. Toxicological information changes. Our understanding of these chemicals and how they move in the environment changes. So periodically, these things are looked at, just as they were last year. And here we are. We're revisiting and trying to make sure that we get a permanent solution now that's more comprehensive than the initial one.
Thank you very much, because I kind of went pretty far down there. I just will say on the Carbonizer Lagoon, go back and look at it. It wasn't excavated. It wasn't taken out because it's concerned about the environmental impact. But that first time people went through that, they're saying, well, why did they not do it? And it says also for financial.
Yeah.
So that's why I always talk on the financial thing.
Yep.
Let's not make it a financial decision.
Thanks.
So my follow-up on that is, so the complete vertical and horizontal extent is what you're hoping to get here.
Yeah.
But if you're not going down far enough to get, what is below the 79 on the chromium sticks, for instance?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me, do you have to go down to where it is clean, a clean sample to get the vertical extent? In any sample that you do?
Yeah, I mean, ideally you would. If you go down to a spot, maybe not to, ideally you go down to where it's not detected, where it's not, but if it's still below a standard and it's not above a risk standard, then you may not. It's really, that's a site-specific decision that needs to be made when we look at the data set as a totality.
Well, as far as the chromium 6 versus chromium 3, is it stable in the environment, or does it transfer?
You know, actually, I believe the hexavalent is less. I know the hexavalent is less stable in the environment. It will tend to move to chromium 3,
And does it go the
but
other way?
it would go. I don't know that it goes the other way as readily in the environment. Most of the time you see it, it's released as 6 and it ends up in 3 in the environment.
Okay. And so you mentioned the rust-colored water. I think we had some results that it was iron. So is it iron flock or is it just rust-colored water?
You know, we haven't done that detailed of analysis of it yet, but we do. I don't know that I mentioned, but we will analyze soil samples, sediment samples for iron as well. We'll add that onto the list because we want to get a sense for the iron. And
So is that the test for iron flock or is it not?
that's a test for iron, the element iron.
Okay, so how do you determine if it's iron flock? Because if it is iron flocculent, then you do have to report it. So when will you determine?
If we observe iron flock, we can test it for, you know, that's a bacterial analysis to determine if it's iron flock. And I don't know that that's necessarily
Who
reportable.
observed it?
I don't know that it's necessarily reportable, but
Can anybody speak to that? It's reportable to the DEP?
Iron is not a reportable element because it's naturally occurring. That's why I asked Paul earlier about how they were going to determine if there's an ecological risk related to the flock. So there's an analysis to determine if that represents readily apparent harm is a defined term in the MCP. So it's going to be up to the team to figure out, does the flock represent a risk to the environment and the ecological habitat, or is it just iron, which in itself is not a cleanup parameter for the MCP, because it's a naturally occurring level. But that's where this is all related to the ecological risk.
So you're going to work that.
so we need to build, really what we need to do is build lines of evidence to explain where is the iron flock coming from? Why is it there? Is it a consequence of what went on here? Is it a naturally occurring phenomenon? You know, so we intend to look at some geochemical information in soils and water, iron content, bacterial flock, and try to piece together a story on, you know, how, you know, including our conceptual model, how did it come to be? And then is it harmful? And it may be harmful and not related to the site. Yep.
So there seems to be a lot of soil movement. How do you determine that soil wasn't moved into the lagoon and that there's not something deeper?
You can't determine definitively. I guess that's the answer. You know, and that's a common problem with having to go back. You know, a lot of these sites existed before there were environmental laws, right? So people did a lot of things that at a lot of sites that they wouldn't do today. But what we do, our industry has a standard approach to site assessment. That's the approach that we're taking here, is we have historical information that directs us to certain sources in certain areas where chemicals and contamination were released, and we're investigating those. And when we find contamination, we will find the extent of it. And where we don't find contamination, then we will presume that there wasn't contamination deposited there and the contamination didn't migrate there. And that's really the best we can do.
So it'd be great to know who the list of people beyond the Mann family is that are answering historical questions. That would be wonderful.
Okay. Yes.
Did you say that chromium 3 is a daughter product of chromium 6? Like the chromium 6 one would break down?
I wouldn't say it's a daughter product. It does. There's no chemical transformation. I'm not a chemist, so I'm going to mess up the terminology. But we do have a chemist in the house, though. But I wouldn't say it's a daughter product. Usually we say daughter product when it's a breakdown into a different, different molecule or chemical. But they're related. It's an isotope, a different of the same element.
So if there are levels of chromium-3 that are above, can we assume that previously there was chromium-6 that were at least above those levels, because some
Not
of the
necessarily.
chromium-6 is, no,
Not necessarily. I mean, chromium is naturally occurring as well. And it's naturally occurring in its trivalent, the chromium-3 state. We can't assume it was all released. I understand what you're asking. I think that we can't necessarily assume that it was all released as chromium-6 and then converted to chromium-3. We just can't. What we can do is characterize what's there today and try to determine whether when there's high chromium, is that the chromium-3 or the chromium-6. We hope to do that here.
I'm just curious, we're obviously looking for contaminants, but also with the characterization of receptors, we talked about water, soil, etc.
Yeah.
As far as like animal species, what kind of effort goes into defining what species are present in their habitats and the extent of those habitats as far as determining the overall scope of impact? And then as a follow-up to that, if you do find a protected species that's in a contaminated area, what takes precedence?
If there are rare species present, they get special consideration, as you might expect. Ordinarily, for what I'll refer to as common species, we look at community level effects. For state listed species, we look at individual animal effects. The site is not listed as the location of state listed species. Tom actually went and with respect to the proposed development, has a determination from the State Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program that the project can proceed without review there. So the state agency that's charged with protecting state-listed species, and I say that as rare species, there's 3 categories of state-listed species, rare being one of them. But more generally, state-listed species, that agency is not concerned. They've gone on record as saying that no further review is required.
I know the maps were redrawn just before the submission of this project, based on, it didn't specify exactly what information that was based upon, supposedly groundwork, but there was also wording that like some of those lagoons had presented enough evidence to be classified as vernal pools, things along those lines. So if you do encounter what according to the information they have is not a protected habitat, but that you see as habitat for a species, would you have to report that and then have that classified?
If there were, if we did, I guess I don't understand the question. If we did find a state-listed species in our work on the site, is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
We would not necessarily have to report that. There's no legal requirement to report that. We'd have to talk to our client, and we deal with that. Vernal pools themselves are not they get special protection under the wetland regulations. They are a special type of habitat, but not, they fall under a different umbrella than the state-listed species.
So the answer is no.
Yeah.
You said the chromium could be naturally occurring. How do you determine whether it's naturally occurring or whether it is contaminant?
the simplest level is the state publishes a table that has, they've done testing around the state, and they've come up with, they use statistics to come up with a level that they consider natural background for chromium. If you're around at that level, you can assume that you're at natural background. There's no other contribution to chromium to the environment. And then there's also, they also publish a list for some sites that have been impacted by historical, industrial activity, anthropogenic activity, and so there's a little higher level there. So usually it's more complicated than that. Sometimes you're comparing against samples somewhere else on the site, or you're just looking at a population of samples statistically and trying to identify whether or not you have just a bunch of noise around a lower concentration that's that site-specific background. If there are any outliers that look like, this is a place where chromium's been released to the environment. And certainly here, we have levels where no one would ever write them off as being natural background, but certainly there's a portion of that that's released that does come from nature. A small portion when you look at, compare it to some of the concentrations, the higher concentrations, but in every sample, a portion of that is naturally occurring chromium. Yes?
Moving forward, since a lot of this is judgment, are we going to have consensus on everything to do with testing between the two LSPs and the town board, which is the Board of Health, that is responsible for groundwater contamination?
Yeah, we're going to attempt to get a consensus on all of this. What?
Can you offer us that?
I can offer you that I can't predict the future. I can say that we're going to continue to collaborate and we're going to do what's right for the project, and then we're going to get a permanent solution that's viable and backed up by science.
But the Board of Health should be involved also.
That goes a little bit beyond me, but what boards are involved. I'm the LSP. I'm here to make sure that that this site's investigated and addressed in accordance with the state regulations, and that's what we'll do.
So you're not going to go to the Board of Health?
John, if the Board of Health just petitions to be a PIP member, then they'll be involved.
Pardon me?
They just have to be on the PIP group. Someone from the Board of Health would just have to be on the PIP group, and then they will be involved.
Testing process?
Yeah.
If I respond to this, Chair for the Board of Health. We are involved, have been involved, and we have a meeting coming up at the end of this month, which is going to be focusing on just that.
I think the process will work. I really do. I have faith in the process that we're going to work together to make this thing happen in the way it's supposed to happen. So this all is part of the process. It's important that we hear your concerns. There's going to be a number of different parties that have input to this plan here. At the end of the day, our field, some of the challenges, we can't tell what's underground, can't tell what's contaminated by looking at it usually, and it very rarely goes right the first time. So it's an iterative process. You go where the historical information directs you. You collect some information, you look at that information, you decide whether it's adequate to make a decision. If it's not, you identify gaps, you go back, you collect more data, and then you and you're driving towards that conclusion. That conclusion is your risk assessment. Is there or is there not a significant risk? And again, I just want to stress that it's a process. It takes a long time. It's never easy to explain to people how it works, and there's a lot of really high-end science that goes into it that even the LSPs don't completely understand, and we rely on other experts for it. So with that, I think there's someone looking to come on after us. But go ahead. Yeah. One more question.
Just as a follow-up on the horizontal extent.
Yeah.
So you do have the Mill River that goes down gradient, and so whose responsibility? Is it your responsibility to notify the downgrading property owners?
So it's our responsibility to notify other property owners if we intend to collect samples on their property. And of course, if it comes down, if we end up at a juncture where we're going to do some type of remedial action or look to place a restriction, then obviously another property owner is going to need to be involved in that. But I don't know what, I'm not completely familiar with property boundaries up in that area there.
Well, it's my understanding, how we know better, that the town owns downgraded property was given to them by the Russo family at some point, I think it was mid-2000s. And there are test walls on it, and there is evidence of flock and sheen on it, so, you know, we can talk to the town about it. But
Yeah, so if there-
it'd be good if there's already wells on it.
Yeah, so again, if there's a desire to sample on another property, then there's a process to gain, to request access and to inform them of what our plans are, and then of course to share the data.
Do they get involved if they're downgrading, they're responsible for the cleanup too?
So the way that the MCP works, it's release-based. So and the release, the boundary of the release really dictates the responsibility for cleanup. And so it's wherever the contamination comes to rest in the environment. So if it goes onto a downgradient property, then the responsibility is still retained by the party that's responsible for the release. And there's protections in the regulation for people that own a property that's down gradient from the released property, so that they're not liable for that.
Did you notify them, or who would notify them if there is a release?
The LSP, if our investigation took us off property, then we would necessarily involve them, and they would be notified of what we know and what we suspect might be on their property.
So that's pretty far from the horizontal from where you're looking.
Yeah, that's pretty far.
At 0.6 miles to where those test wells are, it's just still not clear to me. You can bring this up in comment, but if it's evident that there's flock and sheen, like the plume next to the Mill River, and there are test wells, that landowner would think should be notified of that, other than by someone jogging down the dirt bike path there. So that's something we can put in comments. We're not sure of the process.
The way we understand this.
Well, I was just going to say, please point us to the information that you're describing.
Yeah, we have, it's on the drone and on the Google Earth thing.
Okay.
We can drop pins. On public property, this town and Norfolk property, so we can drop the pins right on the wells.
If I'm looking at the...
I think the wells should be tested.
I'm sorry?
The wells just probably should be tested. That's a good place to start.
So if I'm looking at the site here, the way I see it is you've got a big wetland area up here. You got a change in topography here. Groundwater flows from the facility to the river. I got to believe, and I think there's even some topography even closer to the river. I got to believe that if there's discharge here, that the Mill River is the final discharge point, and there can't be very much groundwater flow up in this area here, just given the topography. So, but yeah, that's it's all part of the conceptual model, the case that we need to put together. So with that, thanks for everyone for coming out. Again, we have response summary on the public involvement plan in the next couple of weeks. That'll address the community concerns that we've received, and then the specific comments we got on the public involvement plan. The 20-day comment period for this particular document opens today, runs to September 24th. So we'll look forward to seeing your comments, and then within a couple of weeks after that 24th date, then we will prepare our response summary and move forward from there. So
Thanks for your patience
Right,
working
thanks.
through all these questions tonight.
no, thanks everyone. Thanks.
So I think the selectmen are here, at least two of them. I had three a little while ago. But Jim Lehan and Kevin Calcutt are here. And I know some people, selectmen wanted to, well, I'll turn it over to Jim and let him kick us off. All right, Jim's being shy. So I know at the last selectmen's meeting that we had this topic on for discussion. We had discussion about having another selectmen's meeting in September to talk about the road closure dates and make an announcement, and that got off track. The selectmen, if they were more willing to speak here, they would be very nice to me and say there was a rationale behind that, but the bottom line is I forgot to tell them, and my agenda was to get the announcements up on the signboards as quickly as possible so that I could let the whole town know when the roads are going to be closed. That's the short answer. Selectmen are, they committed to having a meeting with you folks and talk about the road closure and the timing of that. So that's why we're here tonight. The road would be closed on September 10th. And then September 10th, and it will go through December 7th. That's the date that they're required to reopen them. Hopefully it won't take that long. It'll be faster than that, but that'll be up to the contractor, who is a local contractor. He's MAS Bridges from down on Sharon Ave in Norfolk. He was very eager to get going right from the get-go, so I'm confident that he's going to try and get this project done as quickly as possible and meet that timeline. So that was the one thing that the Selectmen wanted to communicate to you. I'm sure since you're here, you may or may not have other questions. None of us are scientists, so we're not going to answer any of the questions that you just talked about, but we're happy to talk about the project itself.
I would just recommend putting a sign that Lawerence Street is closed on Chestnut Street, because most of the people that cut through that street come from that part of Franklin, so they don't go down Main Street to get down farther, so that they don't have to avoid it. They have no idea that that road is closed. They just see detours going that way. Putting one on 140 from King Philip, no one's going to come from 140 and go up our street to go down Lawerence Street. That's a misplacement of the sign. Because when you go to, my niece was coming to my house and she always thought the road was closed and went detouring around. But no one's going to come there unless you go to Lawerence Street and live there. You should be on Chestnut Street, because that's where the people cut through.
Okay, so up by the Chestnut Club.
Yeah,
It's on Conceptual right now, isn't it?
yeah, there's one in Conchetta, but you're going to want to not come down Mill Street if it's closed. You know what I mean?
It's just confusing the way, right now it says detour end at the end of Mill Street.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
That's just confusing.
Okay.
Because
I mean, I
that's,
get it, that's probably for us in a sense that you can get to Lawerence Street, but I think the public should know that the Lawerence Street Bridge, at least in that area of Franklin, because they like to cut through that area and then come down Park Street to avoid the traffic lights
Yep.
on 140. So that, they can just
Okay.
zip.
Okay.
So that way it's faster. I don't know how it is, but
We get a lot of cut through on Lawerence Street from Franklin,
Yeah.
from Chestnut Street through the park. There's a ton of people go through there all the time. And they're the people who don't know that it's gonna be closed. And they're gonna be so close, they're gonna be turning around in our driveways.
Okay.
Is what they're gonna be
It does
doing.
say road closed to through traffic. which
Yeah,
really shouldn't.
but people
But
are
it does say-
People are just,
And two other sign issues with that, along with with the Mill Street and nobody reading the signs. I'm on Cranberry Meadow, and I know that everybody's gonna get to the end and go, oh shoot, it's closed, and take the right. And we're gonna end up with 4,000 cars on our dead-end street turning around. So I was hoping if there was this is not a, that's a dead end there.
Not a throughway.
Yes, and then also, there's a sign on Park Street at Timberline that is very confusing, because it is a straight with an arrow, but it's right at Timberline and says Lawerence Street detour with the arrow pointing that way. So they're all gonna go down Timberline thinking that's the way around. It is very misplaced. They're like telling you to go straight a little bit, but when you're driving, it looks like you're supposed to go down Timberline to take the detour. Yeah, exactly. It should just be a straight arrow and not,
Like a lemonade stand?
but it's a straight and an arrow.
Good place
so it
for
looks
lemonade
like it's take a left on Timberline. So that was my sign issue detail.
Someone just needs to drive around and see if the sign makes sense.
So that's kind of what I've done, that's why.
Yep.
Well, Cranberry Meadow we use as a turnaround for any of the tractor trailers and work trucks. They definitely came down and turned around several times last week.
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
They came down.
Will they be able to? Is that what it is?
Is that going to be part of it?
is that what you're asking?
Yes. Because very large tractor.
Monstrous,
Several
yes.
times, monstrous, came to the end of the cul-de-sac to use it as a turnaround, both with and without stuff
On it, exactly, with heavy equipment and without.
And they could make it at the end of,
Yeah, it's a pretty wide, the cul-de-sac circle at the end, so they use it to
Somebody
come
with a
down
big trailer's gonna get
and turn around.
trapped.
The number of kids that play in our street, that could get very dangerous.
I had made the assumption they were gonna turn around right in the entrance to Buckley Mann. but-
Well, they set up an office there, so there isn't room anymore.
Yeah, they parked a bunch of stuff there.
That is, I guess that's a good point. Once the road does get closed, everything that's coming into the site is gonna have to come from Franklin down Middle.
That's right.
So there's gonna be a lot of construction traffic, because obviously when the bridge is out, it's not gonna be able to get in from Park. So, is there any kind of restrictions in terms
Well,
of?
they're gonna be working on the bridge for, my understanding is they're gonna be working on the bridge first, so I assume they can come from either direction.
Yeah, well, they're kind of parked everything on, they're setting up on Perimeter Meadow side.
Yeah.
That's, they have no setup on that side.
Do you know if they'll be coming around doing the loop from onto Brett's Farm Road and Eagle, the big trucks?
Probably.
I don't know.
I'll be hysterical. I'll lose my mind. I'm just saying. I will go right out of my tree. I don't know what it is.
We can encourage them not to. I mean, we
know
we
the
can't let
standards,
we can't let people not use public roads, but we can work with the contractors and make sure that they limit that as much as possible.
My kids are grown now.
You said Eagle, and what was the other one?
Brett's
Brett's
Farm.
Farm. There's still children up there. My children are grown and gone.
Yeah, and,
Big trucks, there's no need for, if it can be helped,
okay, absolutely.
please.
Yeah,
Did you ever find out what the fine is if they go over the 90 days?
I did not.
Could we find that out at some point? That'd be really great. There's a big container on the Park Street side of the bridge, and it has a hose coming out of it. Around it has a lot of little things that say flammable. What is going to be contained in that extremely large container? I'd love to know that, because I'd love to know that there isn't flammable liquid or something like that in a container that size. And then can I ask another, what are the rafts underneath the bridge for?
The rest?
It's rafts. What's that?
It's a container, they've got it down to the pond too. For
So rafts, there's wooden rafts underneath the bridge. Does anyone know what those are?
There's some stacked up at the entrance of Buckley Mann, but there's 2 of them.
There's 3 of them.
Well, they have to work on the abutment, so they can probably work platforms for them to work on it.
But I thought the abutment wasn't being worked on, that's what we told the last meeting.
It's being repaired.
One thing is that they've already cut all the brush on one side of that road. It's confusing to the eye, and I can only imagine at nighttime and dark now. Because when you go down with the lights on, it gives you like an alleyway. We had the vegetation, and now there it's kind of deceiving. Now it's going to be just a black line straight out. No. Now it's open for a week, so you got a week that you got to watch out for any young drivers coming down that road.
Or anything left.
And because they took it away, a lot of the silt that was there, it's a drop off, not even more. So if someone comes down, I would have been better if they waited a week to do vegetation and then close the entire road.
We could try and get some reflectors up there.
I mean, they got cones, but I mean, just if someone comes and, because a lot of people like to hug the middle, and if someone comes the other way and they get nervous and they go too quick to the side,
It was
you're going in the drink.
to the pond 2 years ago.
I know, but this is going to be like, at least you get maybe a tree you can hit to slow you down to go into the train. That's gone now, you're going in. That's all.
I have school-age children. What's the bus route change going to be during the construction? There's been no information on that anywhere.
I don't know. I know that the superintendents were both notified, before the signs went up, and as well as Home Bus Company. I think Jim talked to the superintendents today and said they were communicating that information out to the parents. Obviously, if they haven't done it yet, that hasn't happened, but I'll call the superintendents tomorrow and ask them to
Contact
let
the track
the parents know.
I spoke with them this morning, and they, whatever the plans are, they have, they're in place, and they're supposedly, I thought Ingrid actually said that she communicated already, perhaps she is about to, but their plans are in place. This isn't the first time they've had to do this, and for Holmes, he has to do this in 3 towns, because he works the regional system as well, so.
When school starts?
Nobody likes it, but they're prepared for it. I know her plan was to communicate to all of you.
Last week?
If you haven't heard by, like, what's I got the impression that it was imminent. I saw her this morning, I spoke with her this morning, and she said that plans are all in place. I don't remember her exact word, but I don't want to pin her to today, but I know the communication's coming right now. I don't know what the plan, I don't know what the plan is. I'm sorry?
Could we contact if for some reason we don't get the information?
Well, if you have a child that's in the school, she'll, I mean,
Call the school.
yeah,
I would call
encourage you
something.
if you do. I don't think she's gonna miss anybody, but it's possible, I guess.
Ms. Vetere, have a question?
So there's some very large trees marked on the Lawerence Street, the Park Street side again, with those ribbons. Does that mean those are getting taken
I
down?
can't hear you, I'm sorry.
There's some very large trees on, I think it's the north side of Lawerence Street, near Park. Are those getting taken down? Is that the intention, for those large trees to be taken down? And if that's the intention, what's the intention for the road? Is the road being widened in some way?
Well, I can tell you typically, the roads that are marked, the trees that are marked, get those ribbons around them, are trees that are taken down. The road is going to 22 feet in all places, so I think there's discussions between the DPW, the Conservation Commission, and the Planning Board that go on each time there's a project, and they talk about trees that need to come down because the road's going to be there. There's trees that need to come down because the root systems are going to go under the road work. And there are trees that need to come down because they're just old trees that are going to likely come down anyway in the near future. I'm not sure in those particular cases why those trees are coming down, but it certainly sounds like they're coming down. The road is not changing dramatically left or right. It's staying in the center line is predominantly staying in the center line. It might move a foot or two either way, but the road is not dramatically moving, off into left or right into the woods. So I hope that answers your question.
First of all, as part of this process, is this when the utilities are being, so the poles will go away and the water, I know the water main is coming out.
Yep.
So the utilities will go too?
Yes.
Okay. So at some point, will you have to cut out the utilities, like a couple hours one day?
No, my understanding from the utility companies will be almost instantaneous, so they'll have the lines put in underneath before they take down the line. The telephone line, the telephone
It'll
poles.
be quick. It's the same thing they did here in the center of town several years ago. We put all the wiring in the ground, and literally within an hour, it was all switched over, and the poles were on. It was quick.
How about our mail? Does the postal service know they're gonna have a longer route? FedEx. Then I don't have to follow the crazy signs, but.
I haven't had a conversation with the post office, but I will. They're such good partners of ours that I.
Yeah. Want to make sure I get my tax bill checked. Right.
I want to make sure you get.
That's what I delivered that.
You can have to bring a canoe.
Yes, sir.
As you're aware, Main Street traffic, truck traffic, I'm referring to, and car traffic too, but the truck traffic has increased exponentially over the year or so, right? So when and if this project goes through, it's going to be a nightmare, as Mr. DePasso already explained to us. My request is, when those trucks come down by St. Jude's Church, heading out to wherever they go, 1A, most likely, right? They have a need, according to the drivers, because you can hear them, to hit the jake brakes or the engine brakes. I've seen a sign in Norfolk, no engine brakes allowed, somewhere, I can't remember.
On 115 by.
Yeah.
So I'm requesting that, could you look into putting a no engine brakes allowed along that stretch? Because they all want to do it.
Yeah, we'd be happy to do that, I think.
That'd be
Obviously,
great.
Selectmen
The
would-
sign up there, no engine brakes.
We did,
I'd be most grateful.
okay, I'm sure that wouldn't be a problem at all, and we,
As a matter of fact, why don't you do it along the whole route?
Oh, well, yeah, eventually, believe me, this is just request number one.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah, okay.
okay?
Yeah, we did, for what it's worth, they put up no jake brake signs on 115 originally, and
Yeah.
3 years later, we got a nasty letter from the Jake brake company. And so that's why we have no engine brakes, no engine brakes. Yeah.
Yeah, if they can read them, they'll be okay. They like to hear the noise, that's the reason
they love it.
I'm convinced that they like to hear. You're probably right. You're probably right. I was in front of it, when I hear the noise.
I rode a motorcycle, I like to make a lot of noise, but that was a long time ago.
Nothing for the transmissions either.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else?
I have one more question. All right. I want to assume that you've kind of seen a timeline of the project plan, and having seen that, are you confident that it will be open by December?
Our engineers are confident. Whether or not I'm confident doesn't mean anything because I don't build bridges and roads. But the engineers were very confident. They thought MAS came in with a good plan and it made sense. So the engineers are a different company than the bridge company.
Are there abutments being replaced?
They're being worked on. They're not being replaced in their entirety, but because they did some cores and they did some testing to the abutments and they felt that they were safe.
Wasn't that the whole reason for redoing the bridge, was the abutments were determined to be defective?
No, I think I'm not a bridge expert, but my understanding was more the deck, and the deck had been built up so much over time by just adding another layer of pavement and another layer of pavement. There was a lot of problems with the deck rather than the abutments.
Interesting, so why not scrape the deck down like you do when you go and repave a road?
Still a 100-year-old deck underneath.
It's old and it's not wide.
It's 100 years old. I don't know. Yeah.
How old is
I'll let you debate that with Mike. Mike can give you a better answer than I can.
Is there a full set of construction plans available that we can look at?
There is.
The bidders got to see them if you put a large deposit down, but
What's that?
the people who bid on
bidders.
it could see the full set with like 10% bond bid.
I can tell you the planning board has a set. We can put them online if you want to.
Sure.
Cruise them online. Yeah, put them online.
The set that I reviewed had errors in it.
Yeah.
Talked about storing stuff in Natick and
No.
There's a lot of cutting.
preliminary, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, and polar bears on the Gulf States, right?
Most engineers are perfect, not always.
Just a quick question about inspection. So what level of, we have a full-time inspector from
We have
Green or somewhere else, or?
We have a resident engineer that will be on site for 90 days, 9 hours a day.
So just for the closing, the part of the project when it's closed?
I believe that's the majority of it. There may be a couple of days here and there outside of that, but mostly when they're working on the bridge itself. Some of our guys are qualified to review asphalt laying on the roadway. So they don't need another engineer for that.
So it's all from Green that's going to be up there?
Yep.
And are we paying for that, or is that?
We're getting, that's still fluid, frankly, between that and the water line, because there's a lot of parties involved. The planning board is negotiating with Cranberry Heights subdivision. Obviously, the zoning board is negotiating along with the selectmen with the Abbeville development. Our goal is to get all of the costs 100% paid for by the developers. But since those hearings aren't closed yet, we haven't finalized negotiations.
So the town project includes the water main just for the bridge portion, and then the water main beyond that, as you said, is going to have to. So if those negotiations don't conclude within the next 3 months, what happens to that portion of the water main in that section of the road? How does that get built? Who gets paid? Who pays for it?
We'll see. If we get to town meeting and it's still not figured out, we'll have to decide whether or not we want to have an article to consider funding it. Obviously, the developers also know that if they're going to get that water line in for their subdivisions, they need to get it in now, or if they have to put it in the future, it'll be much more expensive because they'll be ripping up brand new roads.
I would assume we don't want them to rip the road up after we just.
We do not. And this winter will just be, this fall will just be a binder coat, maybe spring will be the finish coat, because they want it to settle.
You want all the trenching done now, even before you put the binder, you want it to sit over.
Correct.
So that obviously needs to come to some decisions, conclusions, relatively quickly, I would think.
No, you always pave first and then you trench.
If they're hooking up to Park Street, I'm assuming that's where the water line is, does that mean Park Street will have to be closed for a time being too, because?
No, it comes down 20 feet, down Lawerence Street, the water main.
Or does it already come down? I didn't know that either.
Another just quick follow-up, as we all know, construction projects, always have change orders. Industry standard for horizontal construction is 5 to 7%, so we're looking at anywhere from $115,000 to $160,000, just on average. Obviously, we hope it's less than that. So,
You were part of the projects, you know very well about change orders.
oh yeah.
We both are on building projects, that road work is very different than building projects. We've learned that over the years. Bob McGee has come in under budget on every major project he's involved in town. That's not to say there might be something unforeseen, we all know that. But to date, this type of work, the bridge that was done on Miller Street, we've all come in under budget. Now, again, we're not building a school, we're not building a police station.
Well, I know, that's why I said horizontal construction.
Yeah, it's possible, and if that's the case, then we'll probably have to use some free cash or whatever else is necessary.
So that's the question, where does that come
They
from?
promised that the town wouldn't use a penny of their own money to build this project.
The project is fully funded.
Yes.
And we believe that the project will come in within the funding, yes. We have every reason to believe that. The engineer, the contractors all believe it. You're asking a hypothetical question.
Right.
That is a hypothetical answer. We don't anticipate. We know when we do a building project like a school, change orders are a way of life. And we program into the bid, as if you recall, usually anywhere from 2 to 5%. And but this is an entirely different type of project.
It's, as I said, it's typically 5 to 7% for horizontal construction. That's just industry average.
Yeah.
I mean, private life, what's going to happen? Your bids came in right at the funding amount.
Yep.
So if it's a $50 change or whatever, that money has to come from somewhere. Hopefully, it's not going to be a lot, but I just want to know where that money's coming from.
And a component of that bid is the underground wiring. There were 2 components to it. There was the bridge work and the causeway, and then there's the underground wiring, which I think was $130,000, which still got us within the total funding, which was good news. But that's a secondary component to the bid.
So awarded with that alt in there, so
Yeah.
he's got that in his contract.
So, I think this project scope creeped a little bit since the original conversations when the original grant was applied for, along with the small bridge grant. The plan was to replace the road kind of as is and not expand it. 22 feet. There was a lot of discussion among land use boards and other town officials about what it should be. So that scope creeped up, got more expensive when we expanded the road to 22 feet. Along with that, as Jim said, the underground utilities, that was added. And that's, there's, as Jim said, $120,000 in that part, along with some costs that the utilities will require us to pay. So, so your point of your question is we don't have a contingency fund at this point. What we could do is lean on Chapter 90 money. We could lean on free cash, as Jim said. Obviously, still those negotiations with the developers. Part of the original negotiations with the Abbeville developer was that he would contribute a bucket of money and we could use it any way we wanted. Well, based on a standard 40B timeline, that they should have been closed with their hearing by now. So we fully expected to be able to complete those negotiations. But all the intricacies that go along with that, I'm not putting blame. I'm just saying that process has taken a lot longer. So So we're not rock solid with our little, the window dressings, if you will, of the project. But as Jim said, the overall project is funded. If we need to scrape to get the little pieces done, the engineering, the water main, and the contingency, we'll find a way to scrape through that process.
That was the main gist of my question. I just want to make sure that avenue is still open, because in my mind, that's who should be paying for anything.
We fully believe that we're going to try and get every penny that we can on, to Jim's point, the town does not want to pay for this at all.
So it sounds like there's a real incentive for the town to approve Abbeville.
Well, no.
There's an incentive to get through the
You're
process.
planning on getting that money.
There's an incentive to get through the process.
If the
You
project-
started a project here where if there's any overrun, part of this process is you expect the developer to pay for that.
Well,
Even though that hasn't been proved yet.
So we're not expecting anything from the plastic. We're expecting the large costs are the water main, which the planning board has approved that, already put that burden on to Cranberry Heights. They just haven't closed their hearing, so we can't cash that check yet because that hearing process isn't done. But they've already told them that that's a condition. They have to bring the water line from Park Street up to the Cranberry Meadow, and all the way up to their subdivision. In fact, they've had discussions about looping it, so through Eagle Drive. So we intentionally haven't put a lot of the outstanding costs on to Abbeville. He's already paid $220-something thousand of engineering costs, which he did without any contingency on being approved. There's no agreements that he's going to be approved, and he's already paid $220,000
On the bridge?
on this project.
Engineering costs.
Engineering costs on the bridge.
Yeah. We have no agreement with Deposito with that. There's no agreement, there's no deal, there's nothing. That is a fact. There is no deal. We have no idea what the ZBA will or will not do, or how this may or may not proceed. Our job, we're focusing on the bridge and the road. And if there are contingencies, Mike, we'll deal with them, whether we have to cut back on something or what. I can't hypothetically answer what I don't hypothetically know. But we're going to get it done, and we're only focusing on the bridge and the road. There's no deals, there's no quid pro quo, there's none of that. Think what you will, it does not exist. Those conversations are not taking place. And I know some people in here have accused us of that. That is absolutely not true. It is not. We're just trying to build a bridge and fix a road that is in desperate need, that will only benefit that neighborhood. Because whether the water goes from the bridge up to your neighborhoods now, if we don't fix the bridge and get that water line across, it's never going up there. It isn't going to get there unless we fix that bridge. It's not going to get there. So
I just hate to see it.
we're just trying to improve what we believe to be a public safety concern. Miller Street Bridge was closed for almost a year and a half. We're trying to move this as quickly and expeditiously as we can. I was mad at Jack because the signs went up, and I made the commitment to you folks that would speak, and he'll tell you we had a very unpleasant half-an-hour conversation. And because it's unfortunate. We're just trying to help, and we made a commitment, and I wish that we'd gotten to you before the signs went up. But in good faith, Jack was directed to work through with the developer and move this as quickly as possible. And because the developer's local, he's down in Shire Park, we know him, he's a known commodity, and he's ready to go. He moved faster than we ever anticipated. And there are contingencies in the contract that require notification within certain timeframes of when that road is going to be closed. So Jack didn't have a choice. He had to get notification out because the contract requires that. So we got stuck, and we didn't know. And he'll tell you, we had a kind of an unpleasant conversation about it, because I forgot who sent me the email, but I didn't know signs were up because I was away over the holiday. But we get through it, but he acted in good faith. He did what he was supposed to do. But we don't have any side deals, sir. There are no side deals, and whatever happens with Abbeville is out of our hands and out of our control. We do not interfere with other boards in any way, shape, or form. And whatever happens, happens, and we'll deal with it.
Just to go one critical path seems to be the water main from the edge of the bridge up to the public,
Correct.
because you don't want to go back next year and
No,
dig up
we
the
don't.
road
We
again. So
don't.
somehow that has to be coordinated and worked out and figure out
Well,
who's paying for
Cranberry
it.
Heights is, Kevin's on the planning board, so he can probably speak to it better than I can, but, he's got to get water up there to have that development.
Oh, I know.
So, however this ends up, if he wants to build, he's got to get water, so.
Well, he did say
The board has a little bit of
if he was alone responsible, that he couldn't afford to do it based on the
Yeah, well,
project. He said at the planning board, so.
If that's how the planning board chooses to permit it, he either
Right,
does or
that's
doesn't.
what I'm saying,
his
no
choice.
walk for now. That's,
So, it's up to him.
Yeah, and that actually is what precipitated this. The planning board meeting, which we were at, developer for Cranberry Heights said that he was dependent on the Placido development for the water, to bring the water on the street.
Exactly.
That's what he said, that's why we believe
So his
that.
intentions are
Why
not the full
We
amount.
have that. We have worked with that developer before, and I'm not on the planning board, but I have had negotiations with him on other items, and believe me, they say a lot of things that don't end up being what they will be. Wait till it gets all finished out, and these folks sign off on it, and then we'll all know. In the meantime, a lot of things get said that may or may not be true.
I just don't think we're going to be closing the hearing in the next couple of months, which is
That's right, but then it's too late.
it's not enough meeting until the end of this month, I think. I don't know if they're that close.
I can't say like meetings and the hearings.
Yeah, I'm just concerned about the timing. That's all.
What is the cost of the water main?
I believe $100 a foot, it's about 1,000 feet, $150 a foot, 1,000 feet, so somewhere around $150,000.
So that will not hit the 90 days inclusion. You'll come up with that money.
So that is my goal. And you can hear, there's a conflict here. I mean, some people are trying to stay with the idea that the town doesn't pay for anything. And yet we're trying to get money from the developers. So this is not a simple process that we're going through when we're trying to satisfy everyone.
Can't they reimburse you at a later date if that's the case? If that's
They could.
Just so we don't go past the
Well,
days.
the town can't take a loan without having town meeting approval to take a loan. So we'd have to go to town meeting in order to get a loan.
But if they use free cash or something like you said, yeah, that's a good question. Could they legally, pay back after the fact, if the town fronts the money to put the
Yeah,
water in?
I think that we probably could. We can borrow from the stabilization fund. We have to be careful though not to basically what we would have to do is reduce something else on the project so that we can pay for the water line. And then after we get that additional appropriation or the money from the developer, then we would add that item back into the project. So there's some shuffling of cards that are going on in this process too. And again, in a perfect world, I would have loved to have had Cranberry Heights and Abbeville done, approved or not approved at this point, so that I would know all the cards in the plan. Right now, I don't know all the cards in the plan.
When would that meeting be, that you would be asking for appropriations?
There's a town meeting scheduled for November 26th. The selectmen can, what's that?
It would be days before December 7th.
Right, but as I said, we could make a cut to the projects, and we could say, oh, we're not going to put the final coat down and save that money. We're going to hold off on the sidewalk, the individual slats. And it would be a card game, but we would then get the money, the appropriation, and then put those things back into the project. It's not ideal. I'm hoping that, that the developers will get a level of confidence through their next couple of hearings that they will feel they're going to be approved, because it's in their best interest to have this work done at the cheapest cost as well. If they can fund the water line now and not have the threat of having to put it in later, then they'll want to put it, they're motivated to put it in now.
So the other thing is, how many days additional interference beyond 90 days are you anticipating? Because that sounds like our conversation is in the math direction as well. It's not just 90 days, it's beyond 90 days. 90 days is the full closure.
The project goes into the middle of December, still doing some of the sidewalk work. And then obviously in the spring would be the the final coat of asphalt, but that's a day or two. Probably would not be a road closure.
And the sidewalk would not be road closure.
Sidewalk would not be road closure. And they're hoping to have it all done within the 90 days, but they've put some of the sidewalk outside of that into December. I wouldn't want to be putting boards down in December, but that's why I work indoors.
Just, you know, we have gone to town meeting, I can think of 2 different occasions to get funding to extend water mains because there were issues associated with some of the neighbors' wells. We've done that twice, that I can remember. And there are a number, and we've done it 2 different ways. We've done it through the enterprise fund, and we've done it through the betterment funding through the water department. So this is not unprecedented for us to go to town meeting. And I'm not saying we will or won't, I'm just saying it has been done on 2 different occasions that I can recall.
Right, but that's around 10 days before, if I did my math right, before the close of the project.
We can call a special meeting anytime.
So you can call it.
We can call, we've done that. Several years ago, we had to call a special town meeting when, you may remember in 2008, when the state cut our aid in here. It took several $100,000 away from us that we were supposed to get. We had to call a special town meeting and make unanticipated cuts because we can't negative spend. So, you know, we can do that. If the circumstances dictate it, we can call a special town meeting anytime. We're not restricted to how many town meetings we can have.
Sorry.
As long as we're talking about bridges, has anybody taken a look at the Park Street Bridge as it goes out onto Main? As you know, we had a tremendous amount of truck traffic due to the Park Place project this spring and summer. I mean, I'm on Park Street, it's incredible. But that roadway is covering right in the center on the Park Street Bridge.
I think it's gone up.
I can talk to Bob McGee about that and find out. I mean, obviously Bob works with the state to inspect all bridges. I know the one that's a high priority for us is the City Mills Bridge. That's a disaster. It needs work done sooner rather than later.
Well, the other thing, somebody addressed the Jake brakes, and I can attest to that. Not all of them, there's one in particular that I would have liked to have, well, anyway. They're either coming up loaded by my house or going down unloading. I tell you, going down, a lot of those guys are going, I wouldn't want to have them test their brakes to avoid hitting somebody, because they're not going 35, I know that.
How can you make somebody that way?
I walk that road every day, and it's I feel like I'm walking the gauntlet, you know. Pretty scary if there's somebody else coming that way. Some of those guys are anxious to get their truck reloaded.
That's Lawerence Street you're talking about?
Park
Street.
The rent the project.
Oh, yeah.
Coming out those 2 railroads.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time down on North Street and Union Street with trucks and et cetera. So. Yes,
Will
sir.
you be putting fire hydrants on Lawerence Street?
Yes.
How far down?
Ultimately, all the way to Brett's, at least past Brett's farm. I mean, we'd like to have water main all through all those roads, and including fire hydrants. Anywhere there's a water main, there will be appropriately staggered fire hydrants.
That's good. We've had a house fire. Doesn't make a difference.
The house on, I know the house at the end of Lawerence Street when
The Hughes.
what was it?
Aaron Hughes.
Aaron Hughes, yeah, with the Hughes on it.
Yeah, my front yard was the routine of the one.
Anything else?
They put the sign up because at least they help with planning.
Thank you.
Yes.
Ms. Jones.
It might be more in the planning board area. I believe, is construction allowed Monday to Saturday,
Yes,
but not on Veterans Day?
not on Veterans Day, which is the, I think
11th.
technically the 12th,
Well, they can do
is the 11th?
Yes.
I thought Chuck mentioned something about the 12th, so I didn't look at my calendar, so I assume the 11th is a Sunday this year? So, whatever day. If it's November 11th, they're not allowed to work on November 11th, and if it's a Sunday, then they cannot work on November 12th.
But what's the time? What time can they
7
start?
a.m. to 7 p.m.
7 p.m.
And the police are pretty diligent about making sure they're not just sitting there with their engines running at 6:45. But please call dispatch and have them tell them, because they'll go down and Chief Stone is a dog with a bone on that. He does not like contractors lining up ready to work at 7 o'clock. He wants them showing up at 7, and or if they're showing up before that, they're shutting their stuff down and they're being quiet for the neighbors.
What time does it end?
7 p.m.
7 to 7.
7 to 7, that's our general bylaws for our town.
Do you know if they're planning on working on Saturdays? Is that part of it?
They are not, unless they get closer to the end of the project and need to catch up for some reason.
So hours on Saturdays are different? Is that what you're saying?
No, my guess is if this contractor is planning on working on Saturday, he is not.
I don't have children involved in this, but I think that most parents would really appreciate the bus being a direct route. My children hated where we lived because the ride is so laboriously long. So if they're going to be picking up other children along the way, I mean, especially the elementary level, that is going to be such a hardship on those children, and it's not the right thing to do at the beginning of the school year. It sets them really on a bad course for the entire year.
It's about a 40-minute bus.
Yeah,
ride.
it's at least a 40-minute
My
commute
kid
down.
has 40 minutes.
You're adding a lot more to it.
Yeah,
And that's, I mean, I'm a kindergartner, that's a burden. It's 40 minutes sitting in a bus for
Yeah,
a 5-year-old.
I live on the kind of the Penfield side of town, and I know, I can't remember if it was the morning or the afternoon. It was one way was really short, the other way was a good 40, 45 minutes. You're not alone in that town.
One of my children, they walked up the whole way. And I think they did actually.
I walked a mile and a quarter.
The only thing I say about that is that where we are, they're the first to be picked up and the last to be dropped off. And I think, to be honest with you, for them to be, they're going to be picked up even earlier. And that's getting a little obscene to be that early so they can get to the rest of the route.
Where else is the route go, you know?
All the way to by Freeman Kennedy, all the way up there and back. It's almost better, I know it's not better, that they got short buses that are neighborhood buses.
The high school route is.
I don't want to sound bad for the short bus, but
Yeah.
a short yellow bus. I'm just saying, because you're going to add someone's had to get through Franklin, come out, they go down Main Street. There's that whole turn, you can't,
Have you adjourned?
Right now,
We should put signs up there.